Good morning, everyone. I'm Andrew Holsinger, and I'd like to welcome you to our Good Growing Garden Day. We're going to have a day filled with lots of topics concerning the birds, the bees, the pollinators, and the trees. And I'd like to welcome you. I'd like to remind you to please keep your microphones muted, except for possibly the time of questions. If you have questions throughout the presentation, you can put those in the chat box that you can find in the Zoom chat, the Zoom bar. We like to welcome Katie Parker. She is a local foods small farms educator serving Adams, Brown, Hancock, Pike, and Schuyler counties. She's been with the University of Illinois Extension here since November 2019, and we would like to introduce her as one of the Good Growing team. We will also have Chris Enroth and Ken Johnson and myself presenting. And so take it away, Katie.
Thank you, Andrew, and good morning, everyone. I hope you're just as excited as we are to get started talking about some of the topics that we have today. So I'm going to be discussing hummingbirds and what we can do to attract them to our yards. So hummingbirds are some of the most fascinating creatures. You probably think of them with their flashy feathers, their tiny size, and how quickly they can dart around our yards. And lucky for us, we get to enjoy them here in Illinois. So hummingbirds are only found in the Western Hemisphere, with 360 species between North and South America. Of those species, only about 25 venture to the US and Canada. And there's one that we're most familiar with here in Illinois. They do overwinter in Central America or Mexico. And one cool thing that you probably already know is their wings can beat up to 720 to 5,400 beats per minute. And with these quick beats, because they're so quick, it can take up so much energy from the hummingbird, and that's why they spend a majority of their time resting on branches and twigs. Hummingbirds are the only birds that can fly backwards. One interesting thing that I found was hummingbirds can fly in the rain, and like dogs, they'll shake their heads to dispel drops of water. However, unlike dogs, a hummingbird will shake its head at 132 times per second. So I can't imagine what that would look like if our dogs could do that. But not only is it shaking its head that quick, it's also rotating 202 degrees, all while flying and maintaining direction. So if that's not coordination, I don't know what is. A hummingbird also has a flat tongue with splits at the tip, making it look much like a feather. So if you've ever been able to see a hummingbird tongue or look closely at one, that would be something pretty interesting to see. Here you can see in the pictures a couple of different hummingbirds. These are all ones that are from South America, but you can see how beautiful their colors are. I think a couple of these are from Ecuador and one from Chile. Of the hummingbirds that visit Illinois, there's one that commonly visits, but we also have some that venture over or fly off path and come over and visit. One of those is the Allen's hummingbird, which was named after a California bird collector, Charles A. Allen. I would say that's pretty honorable to have a hummingbird named after you. It's quite difficult to distinguish the Allen's hummingbird from another one that we'll see in Illinois called the Rufous hummingbird. They both have kind of that orange or rufous color to them. However, the Allen's hummingbird has a green back and rump, which if you look at the male here, you can see that it has that green pigment starting in its feathers and onto its back. The female and immature males of both species are pretty much indistinguishable. One way that you can tell the males apart is just, again, that green back, and then the rufous has a rufous back, rump, and tail. For the Allen's hummingbird, their range is one of the smallest and most restrictive of all North American hummingbirds. So they often spend their summer in the northern coastal California and southern Oregon area. They can also be a year-long resident in Southern California. During their migratory season, they can be found in Mexico and even New Mexico, Arizona. It's pretty rare that we see them in Illinois. Usually the ones that do visit us are the ones that have wandered off route. However, they have done this themselves, or they can be windblown. You can see from the map that the Allen's hummingbird has made some visits in Illinois in the fall. So you can see this yellow diamond here, yellow signifying fall, venturing into our south central Illinois area. As we'd already mentioned, the rufous hummingbird is another one that we can see in Illinois. These hummingbirds are usually found in gardens and at feeders. They are pretty fearless. They're well known for chasing away other hummingbirds and even birds or rodents away from their favorite nectars and feeders. So these guys are a little more aggressive. As their name states, these birds are rufous or reddish brown in color, which they're rufous all over compared to what we saw with the Allen's hummingbird with the green back. This is the male in this picture showing his fully rufous back, unlike the Allen's hummingbird. And then the female rufous in this picture has a white speckled throat with a green back, which we can't really see in this picture. And then another feature that makes them easily identifiable is the white tipped tail feathers, which we can see in the picture. The rufous hummingbird likes to breed in the southeastern tip of Alaska. So they will enjoy some of that cooler weather, and they will venture down to the northern parts of California as well. During the winter, they do migrate to the Gulf of Mexico, and you can see in this map, they are much more likely to visit the eastern part of the US. They have made some occasional fall visits in Illinois, again in that south central area of the state. We also have the broad-billed hummingbird. It is one that we can occasionally see in Illinois as well. These hummingbirds spend most of their time in Mexico, but they do venture to the US regularly, with some vagrants oftentimes making it as far north as Wisconsin. The male broad-billed is glossy green on the chest with a deep blue throat, which you can see nicely in this picture. It almost looks like they have lipstick on with their red beak and the black tip that you can see in the picture. You can also see that the females are less colorful than males, being light to medium gray in their throat, chest, and belly with a white stripe over each eye, which is another good identifying factor. These guys are pretty rare. We'll see them mostly in southern Arizona and southwest New Mexico. They typically, in their migratory season, will be in Texas and California and are more rare to be seen in Illinois. There is one sighting that was seen in north central Illinois. There are a few other hummingbirds that we might see venture into the Midwest. One of those is the Anna's hummingbird. We also have the black-chinned hummingbird and the broad-tailed hummingbird. Those will make occasional visits to Illinois as well. But for time purposes, I will not be sharing any further information about them, but I do encourage you to look them up because it's always fun to learn about something new. Then we have the ruby-throated hummingbird, which is the one that we are most familiar with in Illinois. So the ruby throat is the smallest bird in eastern North America, measuring in at a whopping size of 3¼ inches long and 4½ inches with their wingspan. They weigh 0.1 ounces or 3.2 grams. For something to compare against, A penny weighs about 2.5 grams, so it's just a little bit heavier than a penny. They're commonly found in woodland and brushy habitats. The male you can see in the picture, this isn't a great picture, but you can kind of see the red under their throat. And then they have that distinguishable white collar. They do have an emerald green back and a forked tail. As with all the other hummingbirds we have discussed, the females are less colorful. They will have green back with white, black, and gray, green banded tail feathers. The lifespan of a ruby throat is about 12 years, but on average, they don't typically last that long. They'll typically live 3 to 5 years. In Illinois, the ruby-throated hummingbird will make its way north around the beginning of April, and they do start to leave in September, but typically they'll stay here no later than the second week of October. The males are the first to arrive to stake out territories, and then the female will arrive 2 weeks later, and they'll begin nesting between May to July. The males mate with several females, chosen by the female, typically based off of the female's nesting territory. Like many other birds, the male hummingbirds perform a mating ritual. That's a dance that they do. They'll often fly back and forth in a wide U-shaped pendulum arc, making noises with each dive. Then males will also buzz back and forth in short passes while the female is perched. Perhaps some of you have seen this. You can look up some YouTube videos that provides a nice viewing of what they do. On this map, you can see that the ruby-throated hummingbird spends April through September or October in the eastern US, and they retreat to Mexico in the winter. So you can see on the map, we are very likely to see these guys in our yards during the summer months, as they do spend most of their time in eastern US. Part of attracting hummingbirds to our yards is having our nectar feeders out at the correct time. It's a good idea to put your feeders out a week or two ahead of the expected arrival. So I'm located in Western Illinois, just about right here. So off this map, you can see that we would expect that our ruby-throated hummingbirds will be arriving between April 10th and April 20th. So if I want to be able to have them out and available in case there's any early travelers, I could put my feeders out the beginning of April. Something else, if you happen to be on the hummingbird migration route, a hungry traveler might enjoy the meal and possibly even stay. So that's another reason why it's important to have those out early. Hummingbirds also have an excellent memory. So if you have had hummingbirds visit your yard in the past, it's likely that they will remember that location and they'll want to return to their normal routine once they arrive. Our hummingbirds fly by day, so it's important that we have nectar sources such as flowers in our feeders abundant. During those daytimes, they often fly low, which allows them to be able to see and stop for food along the way. It is a long travel and it can burn a lot of calories for hummingbirds. So it's really important that we provide that food for them to be able to make the journey. Typically, before starting their journey, they'll feed extra and gain up to 25 to 40% of their body weight. So they're already pretty small, but they're building on that extra amount so that way they can make the voyage. And this is something also that's very important to remember during September and October when they're starting their migration back south. So we want to make sure that we're leaving our feeders out long enough so that way they can be fully prepared to make that trip again. You can leave your feeders out as long as you have hummingbirds around. A lot of people are concerned if I leave it out too long, are they going to stick around and not journey south? But they have an instinct that they need to leave. And so leaving your feeders out too long is not going to cause them to stay too late. If you prefer a more accurate way of where the hummingbirds are, there are hummingbird migration maps to help us track them. And you can also get involved in the tracking as well by submitting your own sites. So down here on the bottom, you can see a key of the different hummingbirds. We have the ruby-throated, what we had discussed, the rufous, there's a black-chinned. You can see the different ones, but the ruby-throated is this more dark red color. So I captured this information on March 24th, and you can see they have reached the southern part of Tennessee, so they're making their way north. Now that we know that they're getting close, let's think of some methods to attract and keep these migrating hummingbirds in our yard. I like to think of this or relate it to my travel preferences. I always like to find a hotel that's going to provide me with the best and most amenities. We want a clean room with free high quality internet. A breakfast would be nice. And then I also want it conveniently located to where I plan to go. And the same goes for hummingbirds. We are all familiar with our nectar feeders, but there's so much more that we can be providing hummingbirds to create a habitat that they're going to want to visit and stay. So one of those things that we can do is we can incorporate flowers into our landscapes that will provide hummingbirds with a source of nectar. Native plants are great at doing this, so that's a great option for adding to our landscape. Hummingbirds, with the shape of their beaks, they especially like tubular flowers. They've evolved both qualities and abilities that allow them to access tube-shaped openings. Their long beaks being the most obvious, but also their long tongues. Unlike other pollinators, hummingbirds don't rely heavily on sense of smell to find nectar. Instead, they have keen eyesight, which helps them to see bright colors. So our colors like red, orange, purple, blue, and pink can be great colors to use in our landscapes, as that will attract the hummingbirds to them. White and yellow are not always the best colors, as they're not as attractive to the hummingbirds. It's also important to plan for continuous blooming throughout the summer to keep the birds coming to your garden. Hummingbirds will also eat insects for their diet, so it's a great source of protein for them. So we can provide plants that attract insects that is also a food source for the hummingbirds. Flowers such as yarrow, milkweeds, and then anything with clustered flowers tend to attract ants and other small insects. So these would be good options to use in our landscape as well. If you have difficulty finding plants that, if you Google like plants for hummingbirds or anything, you can also look at butterfly gardens, as a lot of those plants carry over between the two. Some good options for plants to include in your landscape include trumpet vine, columbine, and bee balm. Some other great options are blue iris, foxglove beard's tongue, liatris, and morning glory. We can also substitute some annuals into our plantings, such as fuchsia and lantana, as these can provide food sources when our perennials haven't started blooming, especially with our newer plantings. You'll also want to plant for nesting. So hummingbirds are not cavity nesters, meaning they don't build their nest in boxes or houses. Their nest sites are often in trees or large shrubs. They do like to build in the forked branch of a tree along branches or in shelter of dense bushes. So we should also try to incorporate trees and shrubs into our landscape for our hummingbird nest. The nest is always built by the female. It's a compact cup shape of grasses, plant fibers, spider webs, and they're often lined with plant down. They do camouflage their nest with lichen and dead trees. Or sorry, not dead trees. That would be a pretty massive nest. Dead leaves. All materials that they do gather are from plants in our landscape. So again, we're going to want to provide those resources for them to build their nest. The nests are very small. They're only about the size of a golf ball. So if you're fortunate enough to find a hummingbird nest, it can be tempting to watch it closely. However, I would encourage you to watch it from a distance, as we don't want to cause any harm. Female hummingbirds can be shy and skittish, and so it is likely that they will abandon nest. The female does have 2 eggs per cycle, and they incubate those eggs for 11 to 16 days. I've always been so fascinated by wildlife and how quickly they can raise their young. So a young hummingbird, typically after 20 to 22 days, will take their first flight, which is pretty impressive. Females will typically have 1 to 2 broods per year. If they're in a good habitat, they can even have 3. The female will typically start building her second nest while she's still feeding her young in the first nest. So it's pretty quick throughout the summer when they're doing this. Even though the nest is small, it is able to support the hummingbirds in their young by using materials that they do, such as the spider webs. The nests are able to stretch and grow with the young hummingbirds. You'll also want to make sure that you have plenty of safe spaces for your hummingbirds to rest and sleep. So like we had mentioned earlier, hummingbirds do burn a lot of calories in their flights, so they do like to have a place that they can rest. I've often seen them hanging out on like our shepherd's hook where we keep our hummingbird feeder, but here you can see they'll also hang out on swing sets, clothesline, and then often our tree branches. They like to have a place where they can perch to rest or survey their territory. Some spots should be open and obvious so they can watch for any predators, while others should be protected so they can also hide from predators, and then also be protected from any cool overnight temperatures. In addition to relaxing, hummingbirds will also need to be cleaned. So hummingbirds obtain a lot of their liquid from nectar and sugar that they feed on, but they also need water to wash the sticky residue off their feathers. A normal bird bath that we have in our lawns is often too large and too deep for hummingbirds. So one option is to either add stones to the bath to make it more shallow, or you can also add drippers or fountains to the bath, and that's something that they like as well. It's nice to have a place for them to sit within the bath, so they can either sit on the ledge, lip, or rim, or again, they can sit on the rocks. Ideally, you could use like a mister. They suggest either having it mist on leaves because the hummingbirds will rub against the wet leaves to bathe, or if the mist is light enough, the hummingbirds might also fly through it, and then they can get wet from the direct mister spray. With these water features, again, it's essential to keep them clean. Nobody likes to bathe in dirty bath water, and so our hummingbirds don't enjoy that either. Now on to what should we be feeding our hummingbirds? So we commonly use our nectar feeders, but it's important that we're using the best nectar to feed our hummingbirds. The best mix to use is 1 part sugar to 4 parts water. You will want to make sure the sugar is fully dissolved in the water. Whether you should boil the water is kind of up to you. It is a debated topic. Some recommend boiling the water, claiming that it removes any impurities such as bacteria and fungus. And then because you're removing those impurities, they think that the nectar will last longer. But some people also will just use hot water from the tap. So it's totally up to you. I've always boiled mine and let it cool before adding it to the feeder. If any of you have any other experiences, feel free to add your comments to the chat box. If you make too much nectar, you can store it in the refrigerator, but it's only recommended to keep it there for 2 weeks. You've also probably seen the pre-made nectar mixes at the store, which some of them have red in the nectar and some don't. There's been a lot of controversy about adding red dye to our nectar. It doesn't add any nutritional value or benefits, so it's really not something that's necessary. The original claims with the red dye was that it was killing hummingbirds, but there's never been any research done that proves this. So not knowing what the true effects are, I think it's best just to avoid this and not use it. You should only use refined sugar. Other sweetening agents such as raw, powdered, brown, or organic sugar have additional ingredients that can prove detrimental to the hummingbirds. You should also never use artificial sweeteners or honey to make hummingbird nectar. As for shelf life of your nectar, it's going to depend on some different factors. Most importantly is the weather. You may need to change it out every few days when it's extremely hot and humid. And then other times it may last up to a week, especially when it's cooler and if your feeder is in the shade. If you can see your nectar is cloudy, it's definitely time to change it. You should also clean your feeder every time you change the nectar. You can simply do this by cleaning it with hot tap water, which works just fine, or you can use a weak vinegar solution. Some people had suggested using bleach, and that was one. Bleach or dish soaps should be avoided as they can leave harmful residues in the feeder. Hummingbirds are creatures of habit, so once they find a reliable source of nectar, they'll want to visit that source and site until it's exhausted. But this does put some pressure on us as the host. It's important that we not let our feeders run dry, as the hummingbirds may be forced to move on to a new spot, and then we'll lose those guys. We won't be able to watch them. To attract more hummingbirds, you can hang multiple nectar feeders around your yard. Not only will you have a better chance at attracting more hummingbirds, but it also prevents a bully hummingbird from scaring away others. So these guys can be very aggressive and territorial, and it's not uncommon for them to bite another one off the perch to be able to eat. I read of a lady that lives in Smithfield, Illinois, so fairly close to some of us. Smithfield is located about an hour southwest of Peoria, and this lady puts out over 50 hummingbird feeders in her lawn. So I can't even imagine how many hummingbirds she has that visit her yard every year. She does allow visitors, so if you ever want to visit her farm, they call themselves the Hummingbird Haven. You can go and learn some of her secrets. But before purchasing any additional feeders for your yard, there are some things that you should consider. The best sized feeders are those that are emptied every day. So like we said, we need to frequently clean those so that way we don't have any issues with making our hummingbirds sick. Bacteria and mold can grow in sugar water, so hummingbird water should never be left out for more than 2 or 3 days, and it should be changed daily in very hot weather. The easier it is to clean our hummingbird feeder, the more likely we are to do it often and do it well. So you'll want to consider, like, is the fill hole easy enough to get a bottle brush inside and be able to clean that out. Feeding ports are also important to consider by having feeding ports on top of the nectar reservoir. So you can see here, this one in the upper left-hand corner has feeding ports kind of below the reservoir. And so you can often get nectar dripping out of that. Whereas this one here on the right and on the bottom, they're on the top of the reservoir. And so you're less likely to get drippage there. Drips can invite other insects such as ants or bees, and so you can have some issues with that as well. The plastic saucer type hummingbird feeders that we see here on the bottom have feeding ports in the top, and so those make them fairly bee and wasp proof, as well as they have little moats in the center that should be filled with tap water, and that will keep ants from climbing down the support wire into the sugar water. You can also see on this feeder here, they have the yellow bee guards, so that can help protect against bees as well. If the bee guards are yellow, which most of them are, they will ironically attract the bees. So maybe you would look for something that's also white. Many feeders have perches, but some don't. This one here, again, in the upper left or the bottom, they both have perches. An advantage of a perch is that it does save the hummingbird calories. In the case of size, the bigger is not always better. You will want to consider the amount of nectar that your feeder holds. I used to think, oh, I'm going to fill the feeder all the way full. That way they'll have more to feed on. But if we're filling it fuller and we don't have enough hummingbirds to feed on it, there's a good chance that that nectar is going to be bad, but go bad before it gets all used. My advice to you is if you're new to hummingbirds or if you're super busy, start small. If you attract so many hummingbirds that the feeder empties too quickly, this is a great problem to have, but you can always buy a bigger one or you can always buy more. It does take a little while for birds to get used to these new feeders, but they are very smart, so they will get used to it. And then hummingbirds are also attracted to the color red. So if you choose to use one that has that red, that's another way to attract the hummingbirds. Where should we be placing these feeders? Ideally, again, to save them energy, we would place them close to their shelters or perching areas such as trees or shrubs. If it's possible, don't place it in the middle of your yard, especially if it's barren. You'd like to keep the feeder out of the sun to slow the fermentation process, which will help the nectar last longer. Hummingbirds are also fun to watch, so if that's something that you enjoy, place it somewhere where you can easily see them from inside your home. You'll also want to put it somewhere where you can easily access it because we have to clean it and refill it, so less of a hassle for yourself as well. And then you want to keep them in a place where they're not close to any predators such as cats and snakes that can reach them. It is suggested to keep them at least 4 feet off the ground. So I know my parents used to keep theirs outside their kitchen window, and their cats like to jump up on their outside windowsill, and they would just sit there and watch and paw at the hummingbirds. So that feeder had to get moved. And then we'd also mentioned insects. So hummingbirds need protein to build body mass, especially in that preparation for their long migration to Mexico and Central America. The insects that they like to feed on include fruit flies, gnats, and even tiny spiders. The average hummingbird eats about half its body weight in nectar and insects in a day. They feed about every 10 to 15 minutes throughout the day, and they can't live on just nectar alone. One interesting fact too is young hummingbirds are fed solely, like almost exclusively, on insects. So that's another importance of having insects and flowers that attract insects in our landscape. Hummingbirds also use spider webs to build their nests. So it's important that we have those spiders in our landscape as well. You may hate spiders, but they are beneficial when it comes to attracting birds and other pollinators to our lawn. If you do apply insecticides to your lawn, you should really consider stopping that, as that most insecticides that we killed or apply to our lawn or maybe our landscape flowers, they do kill most insects in that area. And then the Audubon Society, they did suggest hanging a basket of overripe fruit or banana peels close to a hummingbird feeder to attract fruit flies. I think that's probably based off of your own preference. I know when we have fruit flies inside, they drive me nuts. But if it's somewhere not close to like a patio or where you're going to eat, again, that's kind of something that's up to you. So that concludes my presentation on hummingbirds. Here are some really great resources if you're interested in learning more information. This Hummingbirds of North America is a really great resource. If you're interested in learning more, that might be a great book for you to purchase. As you can see, a lot of our botanical gardens as well as Audubon societies have some great information. And then to eBird, if you're not familiar with that, they provide great information on birds, and you can track and help with tracking there. So if that's something that you're interested in getting involved with, that's a great resource as well. So this is part of our Good Growing group. We do have a blog and a podcast as well. So if you're interested in learning more about gardening, landscaping, other topics, we have a weekly blog as well as podcast. So feel free to pull out your phones and take a picture of the QR codes, and that will send you to where you can subscribe and listen to those. And then lastly, this is my contact information. If you have any other further questions or just anything in general, you can give me or shoot me an email. And then again, too, we always like to have information and your feedback on how we can improve our presentations. So if you want to scan this QR code with your phone or go to this website down here, go.illinois.edu/goodgrowingdayeval, and you can fill out an evaluation of our presentations, and we can improve for future webinars.
All right, thank you, Katie. So we've got a few questions in the chat box. One comment, they have read that you can track hummingbirds by growing degree days. Do you have any comments on that?
I have not heard of that, but I would think that, so I mean, as our temperatures increase, our growing degree days are going to increase as well. So I think that would kind of correlate with the tracking as well, but I can't speak on that for certain.
All right, next one. I had a few drops of vanilla extract nectar. Is this not good? They seem to like it.
Yeah, I have not read anything about that. I'm kind of like the basic is okay as long as we're providing them with those basic necessities of that nectar. Typically they keep that 1:4 ratio of sugar to water. So that way, that's typically suggested because that's the closest to the nectar that they're going to be feeding on the plants. And so my personal preference is just to kind of provide that basic necessity that they need and keep it at that, because I don't think that there's enough research on those additives to be able to say, yeah, that's great that we're adding it. And if it's not something that's necessary, maybe we shouldn't be adding it as well. But that's totally up to you. And I can do some more research to see if there's any information about that, and I can get back to you.
All right, and then we have a request. Could you put back the two things to scan, the blog and podcast? Bring that slide back up.
Yeah, and we'll each be sharing this in our presentations. So if you can't get it here, and two, we'll be sharing the link to the evaluation in the chat box, so you can gather that there as well.
All right, what is the best way to clean feeders?
Yeah, so I think simple is best. You can just use hot water. If you have, so I found a good way is like a toothbrush. An old toothbrush is pretty handy to have to clean, like if you have the really fancy ports where the hummingbird actually feeds off of, that's a good area to feed or to clean too. If you can find a bottle brush to stick in the actual reservoir, that's a good thing to have too, because that allows you to clean inside the container as well. I know there's some too that were like the bases where that holds the nectar with the ports. Those sometimes come apart as well. I read somewhere like there's hummingbird feeders for us as humans, and then there's hummingbird feeders for the hummingbirds. So typically the ones for us, for humans, are the really ornate, pretty ones, often like blown glass. Those can be way more difficult to clean. And so maybe stray away from that, as it's not going to be quite as easy on you. What else? I think that the more simple the design of the feeder, the easier it's going to be for you to clean it. And so that may just be a way to do it. But like I said, I think simple is best. Just cleaning that in with hot tap water works just fine. But next up, we have Ken Johnson.
Oh, there's another one that popped in.
Oh,
quick.
okay.
Asking about soap.
Soap. So they had, what I read was they suggest not using that, as it can leave residues behind, and that can be harmful to the hummingbirds. So either just plain hot water. Vinegar is one that's okay to use. If you highly dilute the vinegar, you could also use that in cleaning. But I think too, if you're cleaning with every time that you're refilling it, that's going to be great, because it shouldn't really get that dirty. So the more frequently that we're cleaning it, the less likely we are to have excessive buildup. But up next, we have Ken Johnson. So he's a horticulture educator, and he's going to be talking about attracting pollinators to our garden and how we can best do that.
All right, thank you, Katie. So Katie's kind of covered the birds here. So next up, we're going to talk about the insects, the pollinators, and how we can make our landscapes a little more attractive to them and draw those in. So first off, kind of why should I care? I mean, why should we even care about insects and pollinators specifically? So first off, many of our plants are not able to reproduce without the help of pollinators. It's something like 75% of all plants on Earth are pollinated by animals, and about 90% of our flowering plants need pollinators in order to reproduce. So stuff like our grasses, oak trees that flower aren't going to need insects, but again, a vast majority, 90%, are going to need some sort of insect visiting those flowers in order for them to be pollinated. The plants that they're pollinating are going to provide food not only for humans, which is what we typically think of, and for good reason. About a third of our food supply depends on that plant pollinator interaction. It's about 150 food crops in the United States. So we lose pollinators, we lose a lot of our food diversity. But also the plants they are pollinating are going to provide food for wildlife, migratory birds, mammals, you name it. So that's kind of the base of the food chain here that is relying on pollinators. And when we think about pollinators, we have a picture of a bumblebee here. Typically, we think of bees as pollinators, but a lot of other insects are going to act as pollinators to our plants. So not only bees, but butterflies, moths, beetles, flies, birds. In the case of hummingbirds, may do some pollination. Bats are not going to be important here in Illinois, but in like the desert Southwest, other areas of the world, bats can be important pollinators as well. So here's just a few examples of some of the fruits and vegetables that we commonly consume that do require pollination. So again, if we don't have pollinators, we're not going to have these crops. So things like apples, all of our small fruits, so blackberries, blueberries, raspberries, our cucurbits, so cucumbers, pumpkins, squash, all of those different things rely on insects for pollination. You can see those cucumbers on the bottom there, how they are misshapen. That is because they did not get properly pollinated. Those seeds did not develop, so that fruit doesn't develop in that area. So if you have odd shaped cucumbers like this in your garden, there's a good chance they did not get properly pollinated or pollinated enough. That could have been due to lack of pollinators. It could have been due to the weather. Pollinators just weren't very active. Could be a number of factors as to why that happened, but it's a pretty good indication that you don't have very good pollination going on if you have a lot of misshapen fruit, especially for cucumbers and stuff. There are also some fruits out there that while they don't need pollinators in order to reproduce, we do get better yields and more fruit off those plants if they do have pollinators present. So stuff like our citrus, our tomatoes, strawberries. You can see in the picture on the bottom there, this is an experiment they did in Germany. So on the picture on the left there, this is what a strawberry is pollinated by insects looks like. So these flowers, insects were able to get to these flowers and properly pollinate them. We get that nice, large, nicely colored strawberry that we want to buy in the grocery store or that we want to get from our own garden. On the right there, we've got some strawberries where they bagged the flowers. So on the left there, that one was self-pollinated. So basically they bagged that flower. No insects, no wind could get to that flower. And you can see what that strawberry looks like. On the right, that is wind pollinated. So they were bagged, but airflow could get through there. So they got a little bit better pollination. From the plant's perspective, it's still going to have viable seeds, so it's still going to be able to reproduce. No big deal. But again, from a human perspective, we're not going to be very excited about that if we see that in our garden, and we're certainly not going to pay for that in the grocery store. So again, having pollinators access these plants are going to give us more fruit and better quality fruit. And even things like herbs and carrots, I should have mentioned this in the last slide. While we're not eating the fruit of those plants, we still need to produce seed to grow more of them. So even some of our vegetables that we wouldn't typically think of as needing pollinators are going to need them as well. Like I mentioned earlier, they also benefit the ecosystem. So again, they are pollinating these plants. These plants are producing fruit, like the picture on the left there that the birds are going to feed on. They're going to help plants reproduce by pollinating. They're going to be able to create seeds and kind of disperse throughout the environment that way. So it can help with stuff like stream bank stabilization. You don't have any plant material there. Those stream side banks get washed out. You get a lot more erosion, stuff like that. So it's not just the food supply that pollinators are helping with. They're also kind of helping out with kind of quote unquote nature as well, which we overlook a lot of times. So when it comes to pollination, our pollinators are going to be after two things. First is going to be nectar. And this is just a kind of a sugary liquid that the plants are going to produce, and they're going to use this as a reward to draw in pollinators. Most of the nectar is going to be buried deep in the flower and the nectaries. So the insects will have to get down into that in order to access that. When they do that, they're going to brush up against those reproductive structures. In the case of the male parts of the flower, the anther, they'll pick up pollen then, and then transfer that to the stigma or the female part, and then it will then travel down to the ovaries and fertilize that flower, and then seed production can begin. If you are a fan of honey, nectar is going to be the base ingredient of honey, so honeybees will consume that. They will mix that with some enzymes in their crop, and they will then regurgitate that into their cells. So you can kind of think of honey as a little bit like bee vomit. They're also going to be going after pollen. So some insects are going to be more interested in pollen than others, and we'll get to that in a little bit. The pollen are these dust-like grains. You can see this on the top picture there. They're going to be unique to each plant species. So in that picture, we've got pollen from passion flower, peace lily, and daisy. So you can see each of those is unique. So insects will also collect this to feed on it, feed their young in the case of bees. And this is the male reproductive part. So when that gets transferred to the female part, you're going to get pollination and eventually fertilization for that. Pollen is going to consist of proteins, starch, sugars, amino acids, kind of all these essential things for these pollinators to consume. And this time of year, early in the year, it is particularly important, especially those that have overwintered, or in the case of bees, are starting new colonies. They need a lot of that protein. A lot of times when we talk about pollinators, we're going to talk about pollinator syndromes. And these are just basically the characteristics of flowers that these different pollinators tend to prefer. These are not set in stone. These are just kind of general general rules, so that if you were to look at a flower, you can look at these different traits and you can predict what type of insect may be pollinating it. So for example, here for bees, those flowers tend to be white, yellow, blue, or ultraviolet in color. They can see in the UV spectrum, whereas we cannot. There's nectar guides and so on and so forth. We'll go through each of these individually. I will point out that on this pollen line, you can see a lot of times it's listed as limited. There is another column on here that I took off, which is wind pollinated. And when you think about wind pollinated plants, they produce a tremendous amount of pollen. So this pollen line is kind of relative to wind pollinated plants. So just kind of keep that in mind. So first off, we've got our beetles, and beetles are not one of those insects that we typically think of as pollinators. We kind of overlook them a lot when it comes to pollination. Beetles are a very diverse group of insects, so that the types of flowers they're going to visit is also going to be very diverse as well. And again, so these rules are not set in stone. You can see here, they tend to like white or green flowers, but I've got two pictures here of them on goldenrod, so they will also visit yellow flowers. Nectar guides typically are not going to be present. And if you're not sure what a nectar guide is, we'll talk about that when we get to bees. The odor, again, because these are so diverse, the odor can range from nothing to strongly fruity to strongly foul, kind of rotten smelling. It's just going to depend on the type of beetle or insect that flower is trying to attract. The nectar is sometimes present. Beetles are not necessarily all that interested in nectar. They are visiting flowers primarily for the pollen, for that protein and stuff. And the flower shape tends to be large and bowl shaped. So you can see that that magnolia flower there in the middle on the right. The top left with that lady beetle, that's a strawberry flower, not necessarily a large flower, but it is bowl shaped flower, or small and clustered. And I like that goldenrod and some of these other pictures on there. Beetles are typically called mess and soil pollinators because often they will kind of get into the flowers. They'll start feeding on the petals. They just kind of make a mess out of the flowers when they're feeding on them and pollinating and stuff. So just a few other examples of plants that are commonly pollinated by beetles. So on the top left there, we have a magnolia flower. Magnolias are some of the oldest, one of the older lineages of flowering plants. It's believed that beetles were some of the first pollinating insects, so they've kind of evolved with each other over time. On the top right, that's a yellow pond lily. Bottom left is eastern sweet shrub, and then bottom right is that tulip tree. Again, that nice, large, kind of bowl-shaped flower that produces a lot of pollen. Next up, we have our flies, and we talk about fly pollination. Typically, we're going to split this up into two different groups. First, they're going to be the carrion flies. So these are going to be stuff like house flies, flesh flies, stuff like that. Things that are going to be laying their eggs on dead animals or dung, stuff like that. So these flowers are trying to mimic that. So these flowers are typically going to be dark brown or purple in color, again resembling that rotting flesh, dung, stuff like that. Nectar guides typically aren't present. If you've ever smelled rotting meat, or if you have a dog and you've had to clean up after them, you know what that odor is like. It is not very pleasant. So these flowers tend to be putrid or kind of off-putting, at least from a human perspective. Again, flies are not after nectar. They're not after pollen really either. They're typically not visiting these flowers to feed in a lot of cases. What they're doing is they think this is something they can lay their eggs on. So they will come visit these flowers, look for somewhere to lay their eggs. Eventually they'll realize this is not something I want to lay my eggs on, and they will leave and go to the next flower and transfer pollen that way. The flowers tend to be shallow or funnel-like, or they can be more complex with a trap, and we'll talk about that here in a couple of slides, what that looks like. We also have our flower flies. So that top picture, our syrphid flies, hover flies, some people call them sweat bees. A lot of these insects are commonly confused for bees because they'll commonly mimic them. So the flowers they like tend to be white, cream, pale in color. Nectar guides, again, typically not present. Odor, musty to sweet. So we're getting into some of the flowers that we typically find attractive here a lot of times. Nectar is present. The pollen, it typically is limited. Mostly they're going to be after the nectar when it comes to these flowers. And that flower shape is going to be, again, flat or bowl shaped. and then with shallow corollas, and that corolla is just all of those petals put together. So that top picture, you can see that rose, again, that's a fairly open flower. They have easy access to that nectar and that pollen if they're feeding on it. So some examples of some of the different fly pollinated flowers that are out there. So on the left, we have Jack in the Pulpit. This is one that has a trap type flower. So the male flowers, the flies will fly in there and they kind of get trapped in there, but there's a small hole at the bottom of that flower that the flies can make it out of. And these are typically going to be stuff like fungus gnats. These kind of have a musty smell, fungus gnats, mushroom flies, stuff like that. The female flowers, on the other hand, do not have that hole in the bottom. So when the flies get in there, they get trapped. And as they're trying to escape, they'll be flying around. If they've picked up any pollen, they'll transfer that to the female parts of the flower. And they will eventually die within that flower. Some other examples of our carrion type flowers. On the top there, we have pawpaw in the middle there, and then trillium on the top right. And then down below, we've got Queen Anne's lace and common boneset. Again, those smaller kind of open flowers, big clusters of flowers are attractive to a lot of our flower flies. Moths, now we're kind of getting into some of the insects we typically associate with pollinators. Moths, since moths typically come out at night, the flowers are pale red, purple, pink, or white. And a lot of these white flowers, let's say they kind of glow in the dark. They'll reflect the light from the moon and stuff, and it kind of gives them a glowing appearance. Nectar guides are not present. Again, they're out at night, so there's not a lot of light for them to see. The odors of these flowers tend to be strong and sweet, and commonly they're going to be emitted at night, which makes sense. Your pollinators are out at night, so why release that odor during the day when they're not around? Release it at night when they're out. The nectar is ample and deeply hidden, so that bottom picture, depending on how big your screen is, may or may not be easy to see, but you can see the tongue or the mouth parts of that moth stretched out there. So they have these really long mouth parts so they can access this nectar that is deep within that flower. The pollen is limited, so in the case of moths and butterflies as well, they are not feeding on pollen, they are solely after nectar. So basically those flowers are producing enough, if they're strictly moth or butterfly pollinated, they're producing enough pollen basically to transfer enough that they can get pollinated. They don't have to worry about producing extra because it's not really getting fed on with butterflies and moths. And the flower shape is kind of that regular, what you typically think of as a flower like that top left there, or more of a tubular shape. And oftentimes without a lip, because you can see on this bottom picture, moths don't always land when they feed. Sometimes they will hover and feed, especially the hummingbird moths will do that. Just some examples of some of the different moth pollinated flowers that are out there. So on the left there, that's prairie white fringed orchid. This is actually an endangered species. So it's probably not something you're going to grow in your landscape, but it is an example of one of those that's pollinated almost exclusively by moths. In the middle, we've got Dame's rocket. On the right, on the top, that's common evening primrose, and then starry campion on the bottom. And a lot of these, like evening primrose, those flowers will close up during the day and will open up in the evening as well. Next are our butterflies. So a lot of the flowers that we as humans find attractive are also going to be found attractive by butterflies. That's why we typically see a lot of them in our landscapes. The flowers tend to be bright red, purple in colors. Again, kind of like these bright colors. Nectar guides are oftentimes present on these flowers. Odor is faint but fresh. So again, kind of a pleasing odor to us as humans as well. Again, the nectar is going to be ample and deeply hidden because they do have these longer mouth parts. You can kind of see that on the top picture with that skipper. Again, they have these longer mouth parts so that they can access that nectar deeper within the flower. Again, that pollen is limited. Butterflies are not typically after that. And then that flower shape is going to be a narrow tube with a spur or a wide landing pad because butterflies are going to land when they feed. And just a few examples of some of the flowers that are commonly visited by butterflies. So the top left, we've got Joe Pieweed. Bottom left is prairie blazing star. In the middle, on the top, we've got purple cone flower. On the bottom, butterfly weed. And on the right, we've got cardinal flower. So again, kind of these bold, vibrant colors on these flowers. When we talk about butterflies and moths, it's one thing to provide these nectar resources for the adults, but if you kind of want to take your pollinator garden to the next level, you want to start looking at providing these larval food sources. That's just going to make your landscape that much more attractive to them. If you want them to kind of stick around long term, having these larval food sources where they can lay their eggs and the caterpillars can feed on those plants is going to make your landscape that much more attractive to them. Oftentimes, these butterflies and moths are going to be looking for specific plants. So in the case of something like a monarch butterfly, those caterpillars only feed on milkweed. So if you want those caterpillars, you need to have milkweed. You have milkweed, your landscape's going to be more attractive to monarchs because they're going to be looking for that food source to lay their eggs. So these are just a few examples of some of the more common insects or butterflies we have here in Illinois, and some of the different food sources that these caterpillars will utilize. If there's a specific type of butterfly you want to attract, go out and find out what that larval food source is, and make sure you have some of that on your property. And you can see a lot of these will feed on trees. So trees are very important food sources for a lot of caterpillars. And finally, we have our bees, and bees are what people are typically going to think of when we talk about pollinators, particularly honeybees. So when it comes to that pollinator syndrome for bees, these flowers tend to be bright white, yellow, blue, and again, that UV color, which we cannot see. The nectar guides are present. Again, that odor, fresh, mild, pleasant. Again, flowers that we as humans typically find attractive and pleasing. Bees are also going to. Nectar, again, is typically going to be present. That's primarily what the adults are feeding on, is the nectar. Pollen, limited. Again, remember, this is relative to wind pollinated plants. So these plants still do produce quite a bit of pollen. You can see that picture on the top there, those big yellow pouches on the hind legs, that is actually pollen that bee has collected and packed that onto its legs. So oftentimes this pollen can be a little bit sticky. The bees will like that. It's easier to pack that onto their legs. And then that flower shape shallow with a landing platform or tubular in shape. So again, kind of covers most of our flowers out there. So nectar guides, if you're not familiar with what those are, these are just kind of like a billboard advertising, hey, follow this path and you'll get to the nectar. So on the picture on the left there, that yellow flower, that's under normal light. And then the same flower under UV light, which again, we can't see, but you can see that dark area in the middle there. That is that nectar guide. And again, kind of guiding those bees, those insects down towards the center of that flower where that nectar is. Same thing, same idea with that picture on the right there with that foxglove. Again, all those little dots leading the insects or the bees, whatever's after that nectar, leading that back into the flower so they can access that nectar. So we'll talk about because bees are probably the most important pollinators we have out there, we'll talk about some of the different types of bees that we commonly encounter here in Illinois. So first off, we've got honeybee. This is the bee that most people think about or know about. It is actually not native to North America. It was brought over by European settlers hundreds of years ago. Is actually native to Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Africa. It is going to be the most important bee for crop pollination because we can put these in hives, and we can kind of ship them long distances. They're cavity nesters, which is why we can do that. They have these large colonies. They can reach up to 50,000 individuals kind of at their peak. They're perennial, so they'll overwinter and they will kind of keep on going year after year after year. They are generalist pollinators, so they'll visit a wide variety of different types of plants. But when it comes to a lot of our native plants, they are not particularly efficient pollinators of them, primarily because they didn't evolve with them. Like our native bees have, a lot of our native plants need something called buzz pollination or sonication. So those flowers need to be vibrated in order for that pollen to be released. And that is not something that honeybees will do. Or a lot of our native bees will do that though. So just exactly how many different types of bees out there. So again, general public, honeybees, maybe bumblebees, but there's a lot of other different types of bees out there. About 20,000 species worldwide. In the US, we have about 4,000 species. And in Illinois, there's been about 500 species discovered here in the state. In Carlinville, Illinois, over by Andrew, they've done some studies over there, and they found 228 different species of bees just in the Carlinville area. So there's a lot of bee diversity that's out there that we're just not really aware of because we kind of overlook them. So some of the different types of bees that we can find in Illinois, we've got our bumblebees. So bumblebees are actually native to all continents except for Australia and Antarctica. They have been introduced to Australia though. They will do this buzz pollination. So they are capable of vibrating their bodies, which is frequency is close to a middle C musical note. So if you're ever on Jeopardy and that comes up, you may find that useful. And they can also operate in cooler temperatures than compared to honeybees. So again, they can shake their bodies, vibrate their bodies to warm up. They will bask in the sun to warm themselves up. You can see a lot of times they have a lot of black on them that helps them warm up on cooler days and early in the morning. They are also social insects. Their colonies do not get nearly as large, typically 500 to 400 individuals, or 50 to 400 individuals, kind of at their peak. They are cavity nesting, typically a lot of times in the ground in abandoned rodent burrows. So you can see this bottom picture here, that is a bumblebee colony there in the ground. That particular species is in England. It's not one we have here in the US, but just kind of demonstrate what that colony will look like in the ground. Typically, they're going to build and provision their own nests. So they will build their own nests. They will go out and collect their own pollen and nectar, stuff like that. But there are a few species that will parasitize others. So the queen will kind of go in and lay their eggs in other bumblebee colonies and have those other bumblebees care for her young. And they are also generalist pollinators. So they're going to visit a wide variety of different types of flowers. And in Illinois, we've got 11 species of bumblebees here in Illinois. Next, we've got our carpenter bees. Carpenter bees are mostly tropical species, but we do have one species here in Illinois, the eastern carpenter bee. If you have a wood deck, wood siding, something like that, you may have had some run-ins with carpenter bees. These are large bees. So they typically like larger flowers, open-faced flowers, but they will also rob nectar. So if it's a smaller flower, they'll go up to it, they'll cut a hole in the base of that flower so they can access that nectar, bypassing the pollen and stuff. So they're not really doing any pollination for the flower, which is why it's considered robbing. There's really no benefit to that bee visiting that flower when they cut that hole and drink that nectar. Because they do like to nest in wood and stuff, they are sometimes considered a pest, especially again, if they're in your house, in your siding, on your deck, in the rafters of your garage, something like that. Easiest way to stop that is to paint the wood. They do not like painted surfaces. So if you paint the wood, a lot of times that's going to stop right there. These bees can be either solitary or social. So you'll have a solitary, you'll have one female digging that nest, creating that nest, laying all the eggs, collecting all the food. Sometimes you may get a couple females working together to do this. On the bottom there, you can see an example of their nest. So again, they're digging this out into solid wood and laying their eggs in there. And these are also going to be generalist pollinators. So again, they're visiting a wide variety of different plants. We have another type of carpenter bee. These are commonly called small carpenter bees because they are much smaller than our eastern carpenter bees. There are about 21 species in the US and Canada. And their jaws are much weaker than large carpenter bees, so they are not going to be building their nests in solid wood. They're actually going to be using the pithy centers of stem. So you can see that on the bottom there. They've kind of hollowed this out, and again, they've laid an egg in there, and they've provisioned each of those eggs with some pollen in there. So this is one of those insects where you'd want to leave some of your flower stalks behind. So when you're cleaning up your garden, leave 12 to 18 inches of those flower stalks behind. Insects like these carpenter bees will utilize those as nesting material. We have also have mason bees. So osmia is kind of the largest group of this, but there is also hoplites and ankylostoma or some of the other genera that are considered mason bees. These bees tend to come out early in the year, so they are often important for orchard or tree fruit fertilization. So you may have read about some of these mason bees being kind of mason bee knot boxes and nests being set up in fruit tree orchards in order to get fertilization or pollination of those fruits. They're called mason bees because they will use mud to divide their brood cells. So you can see that on that bottom picture there. Again, these are tunnel nesting. So they will divide their individual brood cells with mud. So again, kind of like the small carpenter bee there, they will collect this pollen ball, they'll lay an egg in there, and they will then seal that off with that mud, and they'll kind of go down the line, provisioning each of those individual cells with pollen. When it comes to their nesting, they'll do this in wood in galleries made by beetles. They'll use woody or pithy stems as well. You're seeing more and more of kind of these bee hotels, these bee boxes with these straws or wooden blocks, and they will readily utilize those as well. So if these are one you want to have around your landscape, getting some of those bee boxes and stuff would be a good way to attract them to your landscape. Again, they will build and provision their own nests. Typically, they are generalists, but there are some that will specialize on different types of flowers or different families of plants or stuff like that. And these are solitary nesting bees. So again, you have that one female building and provisioning her own individual nest, but they will kind of nest in aggregation. So you'll have a bunch of females nesting in the same area, but each one is kind of responsible for its own nest and tunnel. Leafcutter bees are going to be fairly similar to mason bees. They're coming out a little bit later in the year. They're more of a summer species. And instead of using mud to line the walls of their nest, they're actually going to be using leaves. So that top picture there, you can see that female leafcutter bee there. They'll cut out these little circles out of the leaves, and then they will then line their nests and divide their brood cells with these leaves. They tend to like leaves that are kind of thin, that necessarily don't have a lot of veins in them. So stuff like roses, lilac, Virginia creeper, ash are some examples of leaves and plants that they will utilize to use for their nesting material. So if you see something like this in your landscape with these nice, clean circles or oval shapes off the margins of the leaves, that's a good thing. I mean, shows you've got a healthy leafcutter bee population there. This damage is just cosmetic. Plants produce more leaves than they really need, so they are able to withstand this damage. So it's not something you really need to worry about. You should be happy about it. And again, like mason bees, they will commonly use these kind of man-made nesting boxes, the straws, blocks, stuff like that we will put out for them, as well as the beetle galleries and those pithy stems as well. We also have our sweat bees. So this is a really large, diverse group. They're on the smaller side, typically 1/4 to 3/4 of an inch. A lot of times they're going to be brightly colored, metallic in color. So you can see these metallic green bees here. Also often have yellow banding on the yellow and black banding on them. Some of them will get their name sweat bees because they are often attracted to your sweat, your perspiration, and basically they're after any moisture and salt that may be in there, which is why they're visiting you. Same thing with the syrphid flies. When they're visiting you, they're looking for the salt and stuff as well. Because this is such a large and diverse group, some of these species will be solitary, some will be social. Majority of them are going to be ground nesting, so they are going to need areas of bare soil in order to build their nests. So if you want to provide habitat for these, you're going to have to provide some bare ground for these. Some of them will parasitize other species of sweat bees as well, and they're considered to be generalist pollinators, so they're visiting a wide variety of different plants. So just a few examples of some of the plants that are typically pollinated by bees. So the left there, we've got foxglove beard tongue. In the middle, we've got smooth aster, and on the right there, we have anise hyssop and wild bergamot, monardia, bee balm, whatever you want to call it. Just a few examples of those plants that bees will typically visit. So the real reason you're probably listening to this is, what can we do to make our landscapes more attractive to our pollinators? So first off, we want to choose heavy pollen and nectar producing plants. There's a lot of debate going on about native species and the nativars, so those kind of cultivated varieties of our native plants. Kind of a general rule of thumb that's typically thrown out there is you want the kind of that straight species, that uncultivated species. Those a lot of times tend to be a little more attractive than the nativars. But there's been more and more research being done on this. The Mount Cuba Center out in Delaware just recently finished up a trial with coneflowers, and they actually included pollinator visitation in that trial. And they actually found some of the nativars are actually more attractive than the straight species of coneflower. So as we start getting more of this research, it's going to be a little bit easier to kind of figure out what the best plants are, which ones to avoid. When it does come to nativars, you want to try to avoid those that have that highly modified flower, so you don't want those double blooms, stuff like that. We want to plant a variety of flowers for season-long blooming and blossom shapes. So we talked about those nectar or those pollinator syndromes. Different types of pollinators are attracted to different types of plants, both flower shape and color. And again, we talked about with mason bees and leafcutter bees. Different pollinators are out at different times of the year. Some of them are earlier in the year, some of them are later in the year. So we need to have that bloom season, those blooms available all growing season for these pollinators. We also want to plant in clumps rather than in single plants. So like that top picture there, if you have these large massings of flowers, it's just that much more attractive to these pollinators. Kind of think of it from a human perspective. Would you rather go to one grocery store to get all your food, or would you rather have to travel to 6 or 7 different grocery stores to get everything? If everything's massed together, it's easier for them to find, and they don't have to travel as far to access those floral resources. So this is just an example of kind of that season-long blooming period. This probably wasn't something you do in your landscape because we've got full sun and shade, but you wouldn't be able to do one mass planting of all this. But you can see here, we want stuff blooming ideally from March into October. Typically in our landscapes, we do a real good job from that maybe May-ish to August, September timeframe. March, April, and late September, October is where a lot of times we are lacking in our landscapes. We don't have that early bloom or that real late bloom a lot of times. So and those are some of the most important times because you have insects that have been overwintering that are waking up in that March, April timeframe. So they need those floral resources so they can build up their reserves. In the case of bees, start building their colonies or nesting and stuff like that. And then later in the year, again, if any of those pollinators are going to be overwintering, the queens are going to start those new colonies next year for bees, overwintering butterflies, beetles, stuff like that. Again, they need to build up those reserves so they can get through the winter. So those are kind of two critical timeframes that we're often lacking in. And just a few notes on native plants. I know we're focusing on native plants today, but when it comes to native, there's a lot of different definitions out there. So often native is considered plants that are recorded as growing wild in an area at the time that scientific collection began in that area. But what does native mean to you? Some people, if it's native to Illinois, that's good enough. Some people want that plant to be native to their kind of their region of Illinois, so central Illinois, northern, southern, you name it. Some people only want plant material that has been basically kind of sourced from their region or their county. So again, what native is going to vary depending on the individual. So there's my definition of native may be different than yours, and that's okay. And just because it's a native plant doesn't mean it's a good garden plant. A lot of our native plants can be rather aggressive and take over small areas. So that's probably not something, if you have a smaller landscape, that you would want to plant. Doesn't mean it has fewer disease and pest problems. Native plants still have insects that will feed on them. They still have diseases that will affect them. Oftentimes when things are out in nature, we kind of overlook some of those blemishes or defects on those plants. When they're in a managed landscape, we notice them and we have much less tolerance for that. Think of bee balm, Monardia. That stuff gets powdery mildew really, really bad. Out in nature, yeah, no big deal. In your landscape, you may not be too happy about that when those plants are completely covered with powdery mildew. Doesn't necessarily mean that's going to grow better. In the terms of like cold hardiness, yes, kind of the climate type stuff, they've evolved with our climates. But when we think of our typical kind of suburban landscape, especially new construction, a lot of times a lot of that topsoil has been removed, and we have subsoil, topsoil mix or less than desirable soils. So they may struggle in some of our urban soils and stuff. So just kind of keep that in mind. And it also does not mean they're more desirable than non-natives. So say right here, here's a picture of one of our native plants. It's got these nice little white flowers on them. Say you're on a hike in the woods and you see something like this, you think, oh, that's something I may want in my landscape. So maybe you grab some, you take it home and plant it. What you planted is poison ivy. Poison ivy is a native plant. I don't know of anybody that really wants that in their landscape or finds that desirable. So again, just because it's native doesn't mean it's something we necessarily want in our landscapes. I mentioned earlier that trees can be very important for caterpillars and stuff like that. They can also be very good sources for nectar and pollen, especially early in the year. Here in the Jacksonville area, a lot of our maple trees have been blooming. So again, they're providing that early season pollen and nectar for our pollinators. Some other examples, hawthorn, ninebark, willows, redbud, buttonbush, lead plants. Again, some of these woody plants can provide good sources of early season pollen and nectar. So if you're looking at creating some pollinator habitat, think about incorporating some woody plant material into that as well. And Andrew will talk more about woody plants later today. I know we're focusing on natives, but a lot of our ornamental and bedding plants can also be good. Provide resources for our native pollinators as well. So if you've got some of these non-native things, it doesn't mean you need to rip everything out and go purely native. They will also provide good nectar and pollen resources. They may not provide those larval food sources for caterpillars and stuff like that, but they can still be good in the landscape. And so just some examples here. University of Minnesota did some trialing several years ago, looking at some of these ornamental bedding plants and what were most attractive to pollinators. So top left there, that's allium purple sensation. In the middle is salvia victoria blue. Zinnias are real popular. One that they found was really popular was pop art white and red. This is not a picture of that. This is just a zinnia from my yard that they're almost always covered in butterflies and stuff. On the bottom, we have Cosmos capriola, was a real popular one. Autumn joy sedum, if you have that in your landscape, that is always covered in bees and other insects in the fall. Sunflowers, they are native plants, but they are also one that is very popular with pollinators. If you're getting sunflowers, there are quite a few different types out there that are pollenless. They're intended for cut flowers. So make sure you're not getting a pollenless variety if you're going to be planting that for pollinators. Herbs can also be good sources of pollen and nectar. So if you have an herb garden, let some of that stuff go to flower. We always in our home garden, we always let our herbs go to flower, and they're always covered with small bees, some of the flies as well. Again, good resources for that. So stuff like dill, basil, oregano, mint, those flowers can be very attractive to pollinators as well. Weeds. If you want to have a attractive landscape to pollinators, you don't want that nice green manicured looking lawn. Those are, that nice green lawn is kind of an ecological desert. There's not a lot of stuff going on in there. So embrace those dandelions, embrace the clover. Again, those can be good floral resources. Top picture on the left there, those dandelions, those lady beetles. That was in my yard, found those again early in the year, providing that pollen for those lady beetles because there's not a lot of pests out yet, aphids and stuff for them to feed on. So they'll feed on pollen to kind of tide them over. On the bottom there, we have our common purslane. So again, you find that a lot in gardens and in kind of compacted areas. Well, this can be a food source for the white-lined sphinx moth. So this caterpillar is one that I found in one of my flower beds. So I just left that purslane there, let that caterpillar do its thing, and then eventually I'll got this moth in my landscape because I left some of those weeds. Violets, those violets that you hate in your yard, those are food source for great spangled fritillary caterpillars. So kind of embrace that weedy yard. When it comes to selecting plants, again, Chris and Andrew are going to talk about this later, but these are some good resources if you're looking for native plants, native pollinator plants from Pollinator Partnership and Xerxes Society. Here in where I'm at in Jacksonville, West Central Illinois, we're the Prairie Parkland province. So depending on where you're at in Illinois, you may be in a different planting guide, but the plants are going to overlap for the most part. These are some good resources to check out if you're looking for other different types of plants. Some other garden tips. So again, we want to provide habitat for nesting and egg laying. So again, those layers in the landscape. So we want shrubs, we want tall grasses, we want low growing plants. Pollinators are just going to kind of prefer different layers within that landscape. You want that kind of that diversity. Diversity is a good thing in our landscapes and in general. We want small patches of bare ground, loose sandy soils on our slopes and embankments. About 70% of all of our native bee species actually nest in the ground. So a lot of times in kind of the horticulture area, we want to mulch everything. We don't want that bare ground so weeds don't move in. Well, you may want to provide a little bit of that bare ground so some of our ground nesting bees can have somewhere to nest. Again, allow that untidy garden. So when you're cleaning up those garden beds here, leave some of those flower stalks from last year behind. Again, that 12 to 18, maybe 24 inches behind, so that other 30% of our native bees that nest in cavities can utilize those. Leaving dead tree trunks in your landscape. So carpenter bees can utilize those, or some of our other, those mason bees or leafcutter bees can utilize those abandoned beetle galleries, stuff like that. Letting leaves lay in your garden. Don't rake your leaves in the fall. Or if you do, leave some areas where they're unraked, so overwintering insects have somewhere where they can hang out and not, get burned or shredded or put in the yard waste bags and moved off your property. You also want to provide protection from wind and weather. Just like people, insects don't like being caught out in storms and getting rained on and stuff like that. Run out of time here, so we'll speed this up a little bit. Native grasses can also be good for pollinator habitat. These bunch grasses can provide habitat for them. I've heard of bumblebees building their nest at the base of these, again, providing overwintering areas for some of these insects as well. These are just a few examples. So prairie drop seeds on the left, Cytoscramma is in the middle, and then little blue stem is on the right. And then some of this coloring can vary through the season. So the little blue stem kind of gets this reddish color in the fall. Prairie drop seed, again, gets a little bit of that yellow color in the fall as well. Cytoscramma has some pretty looking flowers. They're really small, but still pretty. Again, some of this habitat providing. So you see if you're going to get a pollinator bee hotel, something like that, I would look for something like on the right. Those nesting blocks, you can take those apart, clean those out. Some of the issues with the one on the left, over time, pests and diseases will build up in those and eventually start kind of killing your bees. So you want something that you can clean up relatively easily. A lot of other insects are going to use that one on the left. You'll have wasps, you'll have spiders, you'll have all kinds of stuff moving in there, which is a good thing, but you're not going to get exclusively bees. In the middle there, those butterfly houses, there have been a lot of studies done. Butterflies do not utilize them. You can still put them up. Again, wasp, spiders will utilize them, but you're not going to get butterflies visiting those. So butterflies are going to be more like brush piles or leaf litter if they're going to overwinter in those. But those butterfly houses can still be good because you're providing habitat for wasps and spiders and stuff. I think this last slide here. So be willing to accept some plant damage. So again, we talked about those leafcutter bees cutting up leaves and using that for nesting material. That big hornworm caterpillar eating your tomato plants is eventually going to turn in to the sphinx moth here. So if you don't want, if you want moths like this, maybe provide a sacrificial tomato plant for those hornworms. And again, if you're going to be providing those larval food sources for caterpillars, they're going to be eating those. So you have to let them do that. Again, follow those IPM practices. So the cultural, mechanical, physical means of getting rid of pests. You don't necessarily want to reach for those pesticides right away. And you want to try to reduce the use of your pesticides. If you do have to, I wouldn't spray them to your ornamental plants or your pollinator plants to be, period. Your vegetable garden, stuff like that may be a little bit different story. But don't apply pesticides to plants when they are in bloom. You're going to run the risk of killing your pollinators. If you do have to apply them to plants that are in bloom, do it when they're least active at dawn or dusk to try to avoid them coming into contact with that, and look for pesticides that are less harmful to pollinators. So if you're in your vegetable garden and you've got caterpillars eating your cabbage and stuff like that, do something like a BTK, the Kerstachii strain of BT, that will only affect caterpillars. It's not going to affect bees and other insects. It's also a good idea to watch your garden, keep a journal, kind of take note of what's real popular with pollinators. That may be something you want to plant more of. If you have plants that nothing is visiting, you never see anything on there, maybe take a closer look. Maybe you're missing them, or maybe it's just not something that's very attractive, and that's probably not something you want to plant more of. And then you can kind of compare year over year, kind of how your garden's doing. Are you being successful in drawing in more pollinators and stuff? So again, there's my contact info. That's what I look like if you don't know. And then again, those codes for that, for our blog and our podcast as well. And with that, I know I've gone a little long. Does anybody have any questions?
Well, Ken, I have to say, not everyone hates the common blue violet. So put that out there.
I don't hate them either.
Well, very good, very good. There are a few questions, and I was kind of curious about these pollinator boxes, hotels. So first question about that is, when and how would you clean out the bee nesting box?
Let me go back to that slide here. So the one on the right there, so that's actually, again, depending on how big your screen is, you may or may not be able to see this, but those blocks of wood those holes are all sawn in half. So you can take that out and open them up and clean them out. You would do that after those bees emerge. Some people will actually take those bees out and keep them in the refrigerator that are overwintering. But you just want to open those up, clean them out real quick before you put them back, so you don't get mites and other pests building up in there and disease as well. Kind of the problem with if you're using the paper straws or the reeds, you would replace those every year. Once they start emerging, get the old ones out and put new ones in there.
Okay. And then where would be a good place to locate a bee nesting box?
So you want to have it off the ground a little bit so things can access it. People also a lot of times put wire over the fronts of birds and stuff can't access it. You probably want to have eastern exposure so they warm up kind of first thing in the morning. And I put them on a post or something relatively close to your pollinator habitat and stuff, if you're using one of these smaller boxes.
All right, and then last one I'm seeing here in the chat box is interesting. So will mason bees and leafcutter bees utilize the same bee box, or should you have more than one? So I wonder, is there competition that might happen here, or territorial tendencies?
So I'm not sure how much they're going to overlap when they're out, but they will utilize different sizes. And I cannot remember off the top of my head. One of them likes bigger holes than the others. So if you're going to do something like this, offering different size holes will make it much more attractive. If I remember, I think mason bees like smaller holes. I probably got that backwards, but one of them likes smaller diameter holes. One of them likes bigger. So usually when you buy these blocks, they're all one size. So if you want to attract both, you'd probably need to get two different size blocks, or two different of these blocks. All right. Hope everybody enjoyed their stretch break, got some coffee or whatever beverage you needed, and we will get started back up here. So next off, we will have Chris Enroth speaking. He's also a horticulture educator. He's up in the Macomb area, and he's going to be talking about native Illinois wildflowers and grasses for the home landscape. So Take it away, Chris.
Well, thank you, Ken. I think the beverage I need, I can't actually have in my office here. So, but anyway, yes, we are going to be getting into the flowering part of the talk here today. And as as we kind of been talking about the pollinators, and now both Andrew and myself, we are going to be covering some of those plants that we can be incorporated into the landscape. And this is an image here I took, one of the highway botany type instances. You're driving by and you see just this massive wave of yellow here. This was in the later summer, early fall time frame. I think this is Maximilian sunflower. Could be sawtooth sunflower, but just, how can you take something like this and put it into your own backyard? Well, there is possible, but maybe not all of these plants, as Ken had mentioned, are quite suitable for being in your landscape. And so while I'm sure many people on the call today are totally like, yes, we want more of these wild native plants in our yards, it's not always easy convincing the general public of this. So what are some plants that might be a bit more well-behaved, still perform pretty well, but then provide those pollen nectar sources for our pollinators and contribute to a food web in our backyards? We're going to talk about that. But before we talk about that, I can't get into plants without mentioning how these plants came to be in the first place. And we're going to talk about, just briefly, the formation of the tallgrass prairie here in Illinois. So, long time ago, probably 10,000 years ago, is kind of what would qualify maybe as the end of the Wisconsin glacial. But there were hundreds of thousands of years where there were other glacial events that have occurred here on the North American continent. And you can see the extents of these massive glaciers that moved through the North America and where they resided in Illinois, kind of their southernmost extents. And if you live in, especially central Illinois, it is fairly flat where we are located. And much of that is due to the glacial events that occurred here a long time ago. And once those glaciers receded, our landscape resembled more of the windswept tundra of Alaska than what we have here in Illinois today. There is actually that little pocket, that corner in northwest Illinois, though, that remained unglaciated throughout these events. And if you've ever been up in those neck of the woods, when you've crossed into that area there. It's very very beautiful, the rolling hills and everything up in that upper Mississippi River area. But as you can see, these glacial events came through and they carved out the flattened landscape. And as that Arctic type tundra was left behind, this fine silt and soil particles came, they blew across the river and they settled in Illinois, and it began building up a delicious topsoil area. And while this is not Illinois, and we'll talk about that here in a second, why I'm not showing tallgrass prairie pictures of Illinois. This is actually taken in Kansas, but what began building over time was this type of plant community where on the uplands we saw a lot of herbaceous type grasses and wildflowers, and the lowlands and the wooded, we got these wooded draws with trees and shrubs. And over time, these plants became very adapted to this type of a landscape and became kind of the dominant plant community throughout most of Illinois, mostly central, northern Illinois, southern Illinois, more forested, of course. But what kept it like this? Well, the prevailing thought is it was fire. With being such a flat landscape, it was pretty easy for fire to spread quickly across Illinois, and it was only really stopped by the different streams and rivers that would block its path. So fire was one of the natural fire causes, say from a lightning strike or something, was one of the main drivers for building this tallgrass prairie community. About 10,000 years ago, though, as the glacial period was ending and we had humans began moving into the North American continent, they also took up a regime of fire management on the tallgrass prairies, because the Native Americans saw that this was a very useful ecosystem for both their hunting and their agricultural purposes. And so they utilized fire quite a bit and managed much of North America with this tool. And then the Europeans showed up, not adapted at all to this landscape or with any type of background knowledge. Actually, many European settlers came into Illinois, and without, they would get their claim without ever actually seeing it until they got there. Now, Illinois, as I mentioned, it was flat, was actually a vast wetland. A major portion of the state of Illinois is actually would actually be considered more of a wetland than anything else. And so as the settlers came in, they staked their claims. They actually found that come spring and summer, many of their homes and fields wound up becoming flooded because of the high water tables here in the state. They also thought that because trees wouldn't grow on the prairie, then their crops wouldn't grow there either. And so many of them spent time logging and removing trees in the lower parts of the landscape in order to grow their crops. It wasn't until they figured out that they could break through that tough sod with that mold bore plow invented by John Deere, that they could till under that prairie. And it was actually underneath of that thick sod layer was a beautiful topsoil. So because of that, tallgrass prairie does not exist in Illinois today. I know it's very sad to think about that. We might have a few remnants here and there, old cemeteries along abandoned roadways, railroads, and maybe along highways. There might be a few just remnants of prairie, but most likely, everything has been either grazed, tilled, plowed, planted in something else. And so what we call prairie that has popped up that we rebuild is called a reconstruction of a prairie. So it's not the original prairie, but we are rebuilding or reconstructing a prairie. And we think, well, how could this be? You look at these maps of the planet at nighttime and you think, well, look, the dark spots between all of the light. Isn't that where the prairie is, where the woods are? It's where the wildlife lives, right? Well, not really. I mean, I think most of us here are probably in rural parts of the state and the country. This is what the dark areas look like. It's agriculture and natural resource development to feed and fuel those bright spots on the map. But even on the periphery of those bright spots and how we have developed the places where we live, it looks a lot like this. Large houses on large lots of lawn. Do you see the habitat here? I mean, maybe a Canadian goose would like that pond, but that's about it. So this is habitat, good habitat, maybe for a goose or a lawnmower. So we have to be thinking more about how can we incorporate more habitat into our landscapes. And of course, as we're focusing on today, utilizing native plants to do this. So why should you grow native plants? And Ken had also mentioned several of these before. Typically they are adapted to our local ecologies, our local environments and climates. And so once established, they tend to be lower maintenance. They also tend to require fewer inputs. They typically don't need fertilizer, watering, mowing. Oftentimes I've seen folks installing a native plant garden and they amend it with all types of compost and everything and delicious topsoil. And those native plants actually fail to thrive essentially because we've made it too nice of a home. They need a little bit of a challenge there. So they're not adapted to those modified soils. The native plants can work in improving soils. And so that is especially true say if I back up here to this picture, what is the typical development pattern but to strip off all the topsoil and vegetation of a site and you're left with subsoil. Native plants are one of those types of tools we can use to help improve soil. It can provide habitat for food and wildlife. And that again, the focus of today, and help to ease stress on wildlife populations as we take those massive seas of lawn and hopefully we add pockets of pollinator habitat. And if you're supporting, say, a monarch butterfly, you are supporting other organisms out there, other wildlife species out there. It's not just, the one plant just doesn't support the one monarch butterfly. There's a whole host of things that can cascade from there. Of course, there's downsides. There's no such thing as a magic, silver bullet for fixing the world's problems. So, you're going to get more bugs if you use native plants. And as I think Ken and Katie and Andrew will all agree, that's a good thing. Insects are integral parts to our natural areas. So expect to see more insects on plants and cheer them on. Not all native plants will behave. Some will spread because that's what nature has intended for them to do. The other interesting thing about native plants in just choosing the straight species is there's more genetic diversity. So even though you might be planting all purple coneflower, because these are, are got from a seed source, they might have different kind of traits. Maybe some are a little taller, shorter, maybe some don't flower, have a maybe not as vibrant display of color. That's just like having, a family, mom, dad, and then say if they have several kids, the kids, they're different heights, maybe different eye color, hair color, even though from the same two parents, there is that genetic diversity within that. Same thing happens with our native plant community. Also, because these are not cultivated plants, that means that they haven't been bred by the landscape trade for flower color, disease resistance, insect pressure resistance. They may not be as prolific. They might have diseases. So there are downsides to that. But when I see this list, I'm not really, for me personally, I don't see too many downsides here. So let's talk about some native plants for Illinois. And I know we all know about purple coneflower, so I'm not going to necessarily get into purple coneflower. We're going to try to get into a few others. Maybe you try, some you definitely will recognize, some maybe that might be new for you. And Ken already covered this. What is native? It is a broad term, as he said, and it really depends on what does native mean to you. If you're wondering if a plant is native, you can reach out to your local extension office, chat with a master gardener, master naturalist, soil conservation. There's native plant organizations around the state. And I really do like using the IllinoisWildflowers.org as a resource for learning more about native plants. But I will point out one thing about if you're going to purchase native plants. Now, there's two types of ways that a grower can acquire plants and sell them to you. One is nursery grown. Now, nursery grown means these plants are typically harvested from a wild area, and then they bring them into the nursery and they grow them in a year or so for sale in the nursery. There's also nursery propagated plants. Now, these are plants that are propagated and grown at the nursery. It's a typical recommendation for us to say it is best to select nursery propagated plants because we're not going out and disturbing the natural ecosystems. Now, there are several native plant growers that do utilize natural areas, that they might own that property for, looking at different types of native plants. Maybe they see some different, that genetic variability, as I mentioned before, in a certain species. And so they might utilize that stock in their own sale. But typically we want to be avoiding as much disturbance out in the natural ecosystems as possible. And one of those examples of that would be ramps. At one time, ramps, which is a kind of a common forage and edible plant that you might find growing outside in the woods, was harvested to the point where it could not be found anymore. So, but as long now we're kind of leaving it alone, we're starting to see that pop back up. We're going to cover these different species here. Just want to show that to you right off the bat. We're going to try to go in an order that goes from a spring, summer to fall bloom period. And start with what is beginning to poke its head out of the ground, at least in my backyard, Virginia bluebells. I've known this plant for a long time, but I did not know I knew this plant. I've seen this since I've been growing up as a young kid, the blue flowers that pop up in the wooded understory. So obviously in that type of conditions, we know this is a part to a full shade type plant. It's a spring ephemeral. So that means that you see the flower and the vegetation comes up in the early spring, the flower fades, the vegetation photosynthesizes and gets that energy before the canopy of the trees leaf out. And that builds up the energy for next year. The leaves die. And so usually by the time you get to summer, you have a bare spot. So usually you would interplant other things in along with this in these shaded areas, more shade tolerant plants in these spots. In terms of spreading, it spreads. So you want to give it some room to grow. It's the natural spread of just one single plant might be about 18 inches, but it will move on you. So put this in a place where that's okay. The nice thing about this is that it is tolerant of wet soils. And so, again, being in Illinois with usually a flat, not as good as drained surface as most other areas, Virginia bluebells will do very well. And it is attractive to bees and butterflies and hummingbirds. And so a very popular one out there. And so just absolutely, I love the flowers as they emerge, begin to open up. They start pink and then they open up as blue. And then on the right there is actually the flowers with that vegetation there. And flowers will fade and let the vegetation fade on its own. That's at least what I do. And once the vegetation's gone, you can either, cut it off, rake it off, or, just cover it up with a little bit of mulch or leaf mulch. Now, I have loved walking through the woods and just stumbling upon just these little clusters of woodland phlox. And it's another one of those that has been, actually some woodland phlox species have been cultivated and bred for sale in the nursery trade. But just even as a straight species, this is a nice upright forming clump of spring blooming flowers. Once again, we're looking at kind of a full at a part shade setting. It only gets about a foot tall, but I just absolutely love these dainty, very light purple flowers. In terms of where to plant this, as it'll flower in the spring and it'll fade then in the summer. It likes that rich, moist, organic type soils that you might find in, say, more of like a woodland area, woodland setting. Powdery mildew can be an issue with this, but again, if you don't see that as a problem, then it's not a problem. You can cut back some of the flower stalks and the vegetation a little bit after flowering, which will limit mildew because it gets more airflow into that plant. Also rabbits and spider mites are also fond of these. These are another one that will spread and naturalize. So just make sure you're planting it in a place where it's allowed to do that. Then we have columbine. And so for the hummingbirds out there and other pollinators as well, this is one that I actually have a lot of in my newer home that we recently moved into. And we didn't realize it. I saw one plant pop up in the side yard, and turns out it's everywhere. And we have hummingbirds all over the place. And we don't set out feeders, but we have columbine, I think, in every single planting bed in our home. And the hummingbirds absolutely love this plant. Part shade to sun. And I have noticed this in my landscape. Of course, the stuff that's in the full sun, you get a little bit more leaf cover, you get a little bit more flower show, but the stuff in the part shade still performs. It still does its task. So it has these red blooms with that yellow kind of center tip to it, which is attractive to hummingbirds. It does tolerate dry shade, and it does not necessarily like to be have wet feet. As I said, it's all over my yard, so it goes to seed, it spreads. And in addition, there are other cultivated varieties of columbine that you can find out there in a nursery. And I do want to mention, there is the leaf miners. And I've gotten phone calls a few times over the years. People have said, what's going on with my columbine leaf here? Is this something that I need to spray? And it's certainly not. Leaf miners is just a cosmetic thing. It's just another one of those insects out there contributing to that web of life here in the Illinois landscape. And just, again, looking at that columbine flower, just absolutely beautiful. If you want a new perspective of this plant, lay down on your back and look into that flower. It is very neat to change your angle of viewing. Now, another one here that I really like this one, Arkansas Blue Star. Now, Amsonia hubrichtii. Now, this is where we get into that, what is native to you? Now, this is not technically native to Illinois. You would find this more in Arkansas, Oklahoma, places down to the south. But it is hardy to zone 5, and you can grow it here. And it has been cultivated in the landscape trade. This is one of those, when I first saw it in the nursery, I got very excited and I immediately bought, I think I bought 2 plants. I think that's all they had at the time. And that was about 4 or 5 years ago. I planted it, and that first year, those plants were loaded with tussock moth larvae, caterpillars, which totally stripped and defoliated the plants. Now, at first you're like, oh no, this is no good. And it might be a little stressful on a newly planted plant, but it rebounded just fine, put out a new flush of growth, and I felt pretty good, contributing again that larval food source for another insect species out there. So Blue Star, Arkansas Blue Star. This one, I would say grow in full sun. Mine is in part shade and it still does a good job. It's a little bit leggy. Doesn't have the flower show that I see in a couple other places, and the fall color is not as good as I've seen in the full sun spots. It can get pretty tall, and the more established ones get tall, like 3 feet tall. And it will spread, but it kind of contains itself to like a vase shaped habit or form. You get these light blue flowers in April to May, dainty flowers, attractive to bees and butterflies. It says they can flop. Again, mine in the part shade does flop a little bit, but the ones I see growing in full sun don't. But maybe if you pinch them back after flowering, that will reduce any need for staking or any foliage flopping over. Also, in terms of the texture here of the foliage, I absolutely love the texture here of the Blue Star. It's a very fine textured plant. And as I mentioned, it does get a fall color. Now, if you are wanting to get a native to Illinois Blue Star, we do have one here called Amsonia. Tabernamatana. Amsonia tabernamatana. That is native to Illinois, but Amsonia hubrichtii, Arkansas Blue Star is probably what you are going to find in the garden center. And there on the left is just that awesome fall color right there. Now that might be a cultivated type of Amsonia. I'm not sure in terms of it with this photo where it was taken, but I'm kind of guessing that's cultivated bred for fall color. But I have seen that fall color in just the straight species as well. On the right side is actually at the Morton Arboretum, where they have interplanted a mass planting of hubrichtii, Amsonia hubrichtii. In the background, we actually have Baptisia australis, or blue false indigo. I just love the texture of those leaves. As the flowers fade, that in itself is a good statement in the landscape. I can't talk about native plants without at least bringing in one milkweed. So probably one of the most well-behaved milkweeds out there that you can convince people to plant, especially in central Illinois, as milkweed tends to have a bad name for itself, which I don't know why, because historically speaking, milkweed was only described as a minor agricultural weed. But Asclepias tuberosa, it is the orange flowering milkweed. And this one, as I mentioned, tends to be more well-behaved. Full sun type plant, can tolerate some part shade, but definitely I would say this is more of the full sun, dry soil type of milkweed. Now, everything I've read says it's not fond of poorly drained soils. I will say, though, I have seen this plant in landscapes that always have standing water after a rainfall, and it still performs very, very well. It's a nice rounded, mounded habit. So again, it is more suitable for, say, a home landscape setting. I would say, though, yes, it's attracted to butterflies. It is a larval food source for the monarch butterfly. I do not find monarch caterpillars on this as much as other milkweed species. But if you need to convince someone to plant a milkweed who is a little bit hesitant, this might be the one to put in their garden. So pictured here in the center, we have our butterfly milkweed, the orange flowering type, the one we're talking about. Probably my favorite, though, is swamp milkweed. That's on the left side of the screen. It's got pink flowers, tolerant of more of a wet soil type condition. I had mine growing in part shade, and it did fine, but it wasn't as long-lived as probably in other areas. And swamp milkweed does not tend to be as long-lived, I think, as other milkweeds. And then the one I think everyone is familiar with on the right side is common milkweed. And it's a very fibrous type plant, kind of a coarse textured plant. So that might be undesirable. People know it to spread and be a bit more aggressive. But again, it's a type of milkweed, and there are lots of different milkweeds in Illinois. There's actually 22 milkweed species that are native to the state. So we have lots to choose from here. Next is another favorite of mine, Ohio spiderwort. Now, the picture on the left side of the screen there, you see purple flowers. Do you know that is not what is actually there in person? Ohio spiderwort in person with your human eyeballs has blue flowers. There's interesting discussions that can happen online. I took a picture with my cell phone, bright blue flowers, look at the screen on my phone, purple flowers. Photographers online will talk about how their lenses cannot pick up that blue color, that blue wavelength that seems to be bouncing off of those flowers. It's not picked up by a lot of different camera lenses. So thought that was a very interesting thing to look at with Ohio spiderwort. But again, this is a full sun to part shade. The one in my yard is also part shade. And it can grow 2 to 4 foot tall. Again, the more shade you give it, the more taller and leggy it will probably become. It tolerates dry soils. I think it tolerates a lot of different soils. The blooms are short-lived, but there are many of them, and they're absolutely delightful to come out and look at every single day. It can spread, and so divide it when it starts to get crowded and give some starts to your friends. And it's going to attract a lot of different insect pollinators. And so this is what's in my backyard. And I loved every morning coming out and just looking at the blooms and seeing who's on the blooms this morning. So on the left side, we have a bumblebee on the left part of the image there. And then that same image there on the right is a green colored bee. And maybe Ken knows the species, but unfortunately I don't. I just know it's a bee. And then in the middle, we have a katydid. Now, katydid, maybe you don't think of that as a pollinator, but its antennae were loaded with little pieces of pollen. And so these are just, I love this plant. You can still see, maybe your screen picks up the color a little bit differently than mine. It's just not doing justice to the color of blue those flowers are. I mean, they really are a sky blue color. This has a purple tinge to it on my screen, at least. On the right side is, again, kind of that, you can see it's growing in part shade. It's a little leggy. It's not as dense as some of the other spiderworts out there. Now this next one, slender mountain mint. I am familiar with common mountain mint, and common mountain mint, that is Pacanthamum virginiana. But we actually had Lane Kanoki, who took this picture here on our Good Growing podcast, and we made them very cruelly pick their top three native plants. If they could only have 3 native plants, what would they plant in their yard? This was one Lane picked. And so I know common mountain mint, but he said, you got to look at slender mountain mint. And so definitely taking a look at this one. When I go out and I do walks in the prairie, I see mountain mint as a stellar performer every single year. It might be the same prairie that I've walked multiple years in a row. Maybe the coneflower have faded out. Maybe the milkweed have gone somewhere else, but it is without a doubt a reliable return every single year. Mountain mint shows back up and is an outstanding, attractive resource for pollinators. It's always loaded with insects. And it can also be a good food source for birds in the winter months. And so these pictures were taken by Lane. It gets a bit taller, about 3 foot tall, especially if you have it in a dense planting with a bit more competition around it. Tolerant of a wide range of soils. I see it in like wide open, dry, baking sun soils. And so everywhere from loam to heavy clay soil. These small white flowers, they're born in clusters. They start in June and they go all the way through until September. Of course, it spreads, but who wouldn't want this to spread in your landscape? So again, Lane provided these pictures here, just looking at these flower heads here. And the thing that he really likes too is that habit or that look in the winter months. See in the dormant season on the right side there, how mountain mint just stands out. It turns this dark gray color and it just stands out amongst all the other plant material out there. And our winter birds that hang around Illinois all winter, they will feed on these seeds that are left behind. So slender mountain mint. I know common mountain mint. I'm gonna have to give slender mountain mint a try. So related to purple coneflower, we have pale purple coneflower. This is another full sun plant, but it can be grown in part shade. It gets pretty tall. I usually see this standing up over a lot of the other prairie plants up to 3 foot tall. You're going to get blooms in the early part to middle of the summer on this one. And this likes dry to medium type soils, fairly low maintenance. I think the flowers here are showy. There really are a kind of a statement or testament. It looks like those badminton birdies that you use. I think that, I mean, yes, coneflower does, but these really do. And very attractive to butterflies and other insect pollinators. Now, if you want to compare pale purple coneflower with coneflower, this image here on the left side, we have pale purple coneflower. It has narrow leaves. They're more drooping, and that disc is more pronounced there in the center. As with purple coneflower, which is on the right side of the screen, the petals are a little bit wider. They stand up a little bit higher, and they're just it's kind of a deeper purple color, I think, also with that. But similar habit for both types of plants. As I mentioned, pale purple coneflower, this can be something that spreads similar to its relative, the purple coneflower. But if you want to try something a little different, check out pale purple coneflower. Now, we mentioned this one already a few times, but I know cardinal flower can get a bad rap sometimes. It's not as long-lived as the other flowering plants out there, but I think it's just so interesting of a plant. The more I learn about this plant, the more, I think we could incorporate this into our native landscape plantings. Full sun to partial shade. Now, the thing about this one is that it really does like moist soils, can tolerate standing water. In the wild, I see this growing alongside ponds and streams. So it's very neat to see in the wild. Interesting thing is it's not long lived, as I had mentioned, but it doesn't disappear. As I walk a few prairies that I'm familiar with, and I walk around a pond, I can see, oh, there's a cardinal flower on the east bank this year. Maybe in 2 years, I walk through there, oh, the cardinal flowers moved to the southern bank. It seems like wherever the wind was blowing or that water was moving towards on that day that those seeds were developed and dispersed, that's where the cardinal flower seems to pop up, in that next year, next couple of years. So cardinal flower, very neat one. This is the red blooming type. There is also a white blooming type cardinal flower. And so if you're, say, investigating rain gardens, here's a possibility for that. You do want to give them room to grow because they don't necessarily like competition. And I would say allow them to go to seed because of that short-lived tendency. And they are attractive to our hummingbirds and butterflies. So yeah, again, just pictured here, looking at cardinal flower on the left side next to a water body, and then just taking a closer look at that flower structure there. Very, very neat. Now, I can't talk about native plants to convince people to plant in their landscape without mentioning black-eyed Susan, because for many years, this has been a very good performer. This has been kind of that gateway plant for a lot of folks to begin planting native plants in their yards. This is Rudbeckia hirta, and it is a full sun plant. Black-eyed Susan gets 2 to 3 foot tall. It can spread a little bit, but it's also tends to be a short-lived type perennial. If you want maybe a longer-lived type black-eyed Susan, there is sweet black-eyed Susan, which is Rudbeckia subtomentosa. So has a bit more downy hairs to it. This is attracted to all types of insects, butterflies, bee insects. As you can see here, there's a beetle feeding on this one. Very tolerant of heavy clay soils, dry conditions. Deer tend to leave it alone. And that bloom season, I think this is why it is so popular in the landscape trade. June to September, such a long season of fairly reliable blooms for this plant. So, not going to spend too much time, but I can't not mention black-eyed Susan. But I should be mentioning most definitely Rattlesnake Master. Now, Rattlesnake Master is one that I have seen perform very well in very lousy conditions, hard clay soil, dry conditions, like almost no water on the ridges of prairie. Rattlesnake Master has performed exceptionally well in all of those cases. It gets a little bit tall. If you count its flower heads, it gets up to 4 to 5 foot tall, spreads about 3 foot wide, but it has a long bloom period, and the blooms persist throughout the fall, so June to September. I say this is a fairly low maintenance plant, and if you look at the scientific name here, the specific epithet, the second word there, yuccasifolium, yucca. It's a yucca-like, so that its leaves are yucca-like. It is the only native tallgrass prairie plant that has this yucca-like leaves on that right side of the image there, the sword-shaped leaves. And as you're sitting there on the prairie and you're walking through or something, you walk by this plant, you immediately know what it is. It stands out. This is an accent plant, and it is an amazing pollen nectar source for our insects, and just a really cool design feature to include if you are building a pollinator garden. As we begin transitioning to later in the season, we can look at our blazing stars. So pictured here is rough blazing star, Liatris aspera. I am probably most familiar with prairie blazing star. You might even find that pretty commonly in a garden center. But this one being recommended by Lane, once again, you know, this is kind of like, this is his favorite blazing star. Full sun plant. It can get pretty tall when you include the flower stalk, up to 5 foot. Purple flowers. It is, of all the blazing stars, this one blooms later than kind of all the others. Which is a good thing, because I think, as Ken had mentioned, that late season bloom period, it's very important, especially for a lot of our migrating insects. It's tolerant of a wide range of soils. So, you know, you kind of plant this thing anywhere, and attractive to many different insect pollinators, and birds do like this one as well. So because it does actually have a fairly short bloom period, it all kind of blooms at once. Most blazing stars, they bloom starting from the top of the flower head and they work their way down over time. Rough blazing star blooms all at once, which actually makes it a pretty good cut flower. But it's a shorter flower show. What could we do? Excuse me. We can intersperse this with other blazing stars. So we can intersperse it with cylindrical blazing star there on the left side of the screen, and prairie blazing star there on the right side of the screen. They all have different bloom times and bloom periods, but planting these all together can give you a really cool flower show late in the season. And then we come to the asters. Again, that late bloomer, late season bloomer. We can find this one in the full sun to part shade. Asters are the ones that we see blooming typically along the roadsides in the fall months, alongside the goldenrods. These can get a little bit taller, depending on the species, of course, of aster, but 2 to 4 foot for smooth aster. Wide range of soils. The telltale aster flower heads, though, the purple rays or petals with the yellow discs in the center. They start blooming in September and will go into October. Very attractive butterflies like the migrating monarch late in the season. Now, because these do get a little bit taller, you might need to stake these or pair them with, say, goldenrod or a fall sunflower, and these plants will help to support each other. And we're going to look at a couple grasses and other things out there too, that we can interplant around some of our taller wildflowers that can hold them up, and so that they don't necessarily flop over as easily. Just some images here of that smooth blue aster there on the left and right side of the screen. Now, let's talk just briefly on grasses, very briefly, because I think that in terms of what we put in our pollinator gardens, the two that I would recommend is little blue stem, pictured here, and the other is prairie drop seed. Side oats grama is also another good one that I like. These are all, so those two are types of shortgrass prairie plants. Little blue stem is a full sun plant. I just love this because of its habit. I mean, look how tall and upright that is. It has been bred a little bit in the landscape trade for its fall color and kind of those bloom panicles on the top of it. And so that on the left side there, you could see little blue stem blooming and have a fall color like this. I have seen that type of color out in the wild, just kind of interspersed in there among other little blue stem plants. But then, the green industry has cultivated those plants and selected those, and now those are cultivars out in the trade. But if you look at the picture on the right side of the screen there, you can see the upright growth habit of that little blue stem interspersed in and among the other vegetation there. It does have that habit that just calls out to you in that late season, kind of like that rattlesnake master. So these plants are very useful in staking up or holding up some of our taller blooming plants, some of our forbs out there. So grasses are also a key part. There are insect pollinators that will go after their pollen and nectar, even though they are not necessarily pollinated by insects, but also they do produce seed that birds will go after later in the season. I absolutely love prairie drop seed, but despite its name, it actually does not spread like crazy. Drop seed, you think, oh my goodness, this thing will spread everywhere. It doesn't. I once ordered 10,000 seeds of prairie drop seed and I got a germination of 2 seeds. So that's not a very good germination rate. So most of these plants though are all planted out or they spread vegetatively. It just creates an absolutely wonderful texture on the landscape. It does also have a bloom. That's kind of this above this wispy grass canopy. It will send up this flower stalk that is also very wispy and delicate looking. The flowers are pink and brown, and they're fragrant. Some people say it smells like coriander or buttered popcorn, and those will persist June through August. Pretty tolerant of a wide range of soils, low maintenance. I would say after a while, prairie drop seed actually kind of develops like a woody base to it. So fire can, I think, be a little bit helpful in kind of removing that. Other neat thing about this is this plant does not get flattened in the winter by snow. And so it creates these mounds in the landscape when it's snow covered in the winter. So it's really, really neat. This is just prairie drop seed on the left side being used at the entryways of a rain garden at Missouri Botanical Garden, and then just that what it looks like in the fall months. And we have our supporting cast here. And just kind of real briefly on these, maybe they're not known for being pollinator plants, but they are important to include as kind of those filler plants. Now, with sedges and things like that, they do support some as a larval food source for some insects, seed source for some birds. So they're contributing, but they're kind of planted in mass in and around. So while we might have been talking about our stars of the show, the wildflowers, we do have to incorporate some supporting members of this display that we would be putting in our yard. So different types of sedges. Pictured on the bottom photo there is actually Eastern star sedge. I actually know this as wood sedge. I don't know how, but I do. But Eastern star sedge, I mean, just look at the texture of it. It's a very nice plant. It fills in that space very nicely. It holds that area, keeps the weeds down as well. Ferns are also something you don't want to overlook. They're neat things to incorporate into a native plant garden. All right, Ken has already talked about nativars, but we better mention this. So nativars, we're looking at, these are plants that have been bred by the landscape industry. However you feel about these, if you have trouble convincing people to put native plants in their yard, this is maybe the route to go. They're a bit more well-behaved. So pictured here is purple smoke baptisia, and this plant is bred for its flowering, but also its nicely rounded habit. New England aster, known for flopping over in needing to be staked. Here is purple dome, which is only up to about 2 feet tall, and it's this like cute little mounded plant. It's adorable. And probably one of the nativars that I first noticed and have fallen in love with is the Irish spring black-eyed Susan. So instead of a brown or black disc, it has that green colored disc. It's absolutely lovely. How good of a pollinator plant is this? I'm not sure, but there are studies out there, as Ken mentioned. This is with the Mount Cuba Center, where they studied echinacea. Now, they studied each of these different nativar species, and the straight species, Echinacea purpea, actually, when they look at pollinator visits, it's ranked number 2. But when they looked at number 1, it's actually a nativar for pollinator visits. So interesting. So you can check that out. But look at the ones at the bottom side, the right side of the graph there. Those are the double flowered ones. Ken mentioned this already, but this is a double flowered echinacea. We've modified that flower structure and made it probably impossible for pollinators to get to that pollen nectar source. So running short on time here, how dare these people give me only 45 minutes to talk? But creating your native pollinator garden, think of your goals. And I'm going to leave some resources here at the end to help you out. But knowing your property is important. Are you going to have a full sun, part shade, all shade? That is going to dictate what type of plant community you build. Knowing what is your lay of the land? Do you have dry soil, mesic soil, which is kind of an average type soil, or a wet soil? You can test this by doing your own drainage test. Pictured here is actually what I got from the NRCS office, but you can just dig a hole 1 foot deep, 1 foot wide. You fill it with water, let it drain, and fill it a second time, and then you time it. And if it drains less than an inch in an hour, you have a wet or poorly drained soil. 3 to 6 inches, that's about average. If it drains 6 inches within the hour, you have a dry soil. There's different ways to plant these, whether you seed or plant plugs or potted plants. To prep the site, very often what's used is glyphosate as an herbicide. If you don't want to use that, you can smother the area with leaves, wood chips, carpeting, or for larger areas, till and disc that. And you would spread the seed or drill it into the soil directly at the correct depth. And it takes time. Pictured here is a year after planting. It just takes time for these native plants are perennial. They focus a lot of energy those first few years on root development, not much on that vegetative development. So for seeded plots, you're going to mow them. If you're transplanting potted plants, you're going to keep them watered and keep them mulched. Seeded plots, you could water them, but very often they're reliant on just natural rainfall. And year 2, that's when succession begins. That's when the perennials begin to kind of succeed to the annual plants that would be growing that first year. You start looking into management practices, burning, mowing. These are all tools that we use to manage our native plants, which they are adapted toward. Year 3 and beyond, there's a lot of debate whether you burn or mow or whatever, and how often. The most common one I found is every 3 years you burn or mow your prairie to get rid of that debris. Monitor for invasive plants. That's kind of the biggest thing when you're dealing, especially with larger type prairie areas, pollinator gardens. You might also need to control your native grasses because yellow Indian grass, switchgrass, big blue stem, they all can become bullies. And pictured here actually is a colleague of mine. We are doing a dormant seeding of only wildflowers. So this is a seed mixed into a potting mix. We're doing it right over the snow so we can see exactly where we put the seed down. It's a very handy way to do it. But we basically pump a lot of wildflower seeds into our prairie area to give a kind of a more of a, because prairies are not necessarily all wildflowers. There's a lot of grasses. Here we're doing kind of more of a show prairie where it's a bit heavier in the wildflowers. So these are the references. These will be linked to you in an email that will be the follow-up to this presentation. I used a lot of the plants here. I went through these brochures by our Sea Grant colleagues. And I'm like, I like this plant. I like that plant. I got to have a presentation in 45 minutes. I'm not going to do it, as you can see already. So check these out. They will be linked to you in a future email follow up to this presentation. This is another great publication through Extension, another one that I used to help prepare this. You can go to Pubs Plus at illinois.edu to purchase this publication. Again, check out our blog and podcast. If you aren't tired or sick of us by the end of this, you can listen to our podcast today too, where we talk about what we're doing in the garden landscape this week. The evaluation, which will also be sent out in that email following up this presentation, and happy for questions.
Well, thanks, Chris. We did have a few comments, questions in the chat. The Virginia bluebells in my yard, which escaped from my neighbor's yard to mine, have pink and blue flowers. Does this mean they are a cultivar?
Oh, no. So they should be, typically they begin emerging, or they will open up as pink and then they transition to blue flowers. And sometimes they hold that pink color. So that is a common thing with that species.
And what is the hardiness zone for the Pachythium or the mountain mint genus?
I'll look that up just to double check. I know the Pachythium virginianum hardy throughout Illinois. so up to zone 5 and 4. I will double check with that slender mountain mint, since that's the one Lane, he really liked and recommended. But as far as I know, Lane included that in these brochures that I shared, those brochures right here. And so all of these plants in here should be, or most of them should be, suitable for throughout Illinois.
Okay, very good. And that looks to be all the questions, comments in the chat. And we have put the evaluation link also in the chat.
All right. Well, I shall stop sharing my screen and give Andrew a minute or two to get his screen up and running. Well, our next presentation will be by Andrew Holsinger, horticulture educator with U of I Extension. Now, with Ken, Katie, me, and Andrew, we all kind of occupy West Central Illinois. And so we are comprised of the good growing team. Andrew's kind of the one to the farther southeast than the rest of us. So located in the Hillsborough area, Litchfield area. So Andrew, as I talked about the herbaceous type plants, Andrew is going to get into the woody type plants. So Andrew, take it away.
All right, thanks, Chris. Hopefully we'll fulfill your native desires one way or another. And one way to do that is with native trees and shrubs. And here we have spice bush. So when it comes to native woody plants, a native plant, for that to be native, it's typical that it occurs naturally in a particular region, ecosystem, or habitat without human introduction. And so a lot of the plants that I will be covering are native to North America. The majority of them are native to Illinois, but there are a few that aren't native to Illinois, but they are native to North America. Do you notice it's pretty common for us to all have some damage to trees and shrubs in the landscape? Well, native trees and shrubs are really important for biodiversity because of the flowers, fruits, and seeds. And these provide needed food for insects, birds, and various types of mammals. So that's one of the issues that we have when we don't have natives in the landscape, is that we lose those food sources that provide such an ecosystem for our environment. So there are aspects that we can look at whenever it comes to native plants as far as their appearance. So we can see here the appearance of native plants can reflect the birds here directly with the yellow-bellied sapsucker. So native plants can be a source of food even if they don't have, particularly the pollen or the seeds or things that they desire. We also look at the performance. Just because it is native doesn't mean that it is going to outperform your plants. There's typical things that you want to look at, and one of those is site selection. So making sure that the native plant is adequately sited in the landscape. And how you site those plants and how adaptable they are to your conditions can determine their longevity in the landscape. And we often want to protect our native plants, but putting them in a streetscape situation can be somewhat detrimental over time. And a lot of times, if it's not the right plant for the right place, we end up having a short-lived plant. So about cultivars, cultivars are known as cultivated varieties, and when we have native plants that are cultivars, they're known as nativars. And so we can have a nativar that occurs in nature. And so this is the cross into two plants are selecting for certain traits whenever it comes to propagating these and maintaining that particular cultivar. So as Doug Tallamy says, we have to convince the nursery industry that native plants are about more than just looks. And so if you've seen a presentation by Doug Tallamy, he really interconnects all the points of the web of life and shows how the trees influence the life cycle of different birds and other animals. So we'll look at some deciduous large-sized trees. Here we have sycamore, but that's commonly found throughout Illinois in about every county. But here we have our oaks, and our oaks are native to Illinois. The first three oaks I'm going to cover the part of the core distribution of oaks in Illinois. There are 9 oaks that have their main distribution in Illinois. So the first is the state tree, the white oak. Here we have Quercus alba. It serves for a lot of caterpillar feeding and famous for the acorns. We also have swamp white oak. The various insects are attracted for food. We also have woodpeckers and warblers and flycatchers. And again, the acorns are important for many birds and mammals. The red oak, the northern red oak, the foliage eaten by several caterpillars of the hairstreak butterflies, and also has nice acorns and pretty adaptable, and has a nice fall color. Now we're moving out of the next 3 oaks are part of the 11 oak species that have their edge of their distribution in Illinois. So we have the scarlet oak, and it has a vibrant scarlet color in the fall, a very stately tree. The overcup oak, a very interesting acorn, and it tends to have a very slender, straight trunk. The Shumard oak, it's native to the southern part of Illinois, but it's hardy to the northern part of the state as well. And this species can be utilized as a street tree, but it may be difficult to find. And some of these particular native plants often are hard to find in the nursery trade. Now there is a competition between oaks and maples, and I put this slide in because all too often our native red maples have been kind of overplanted, and so we can consider that they are very adapted to different environments, but they don't typically work well for street trees. They do have excellent fall color, and the blooms can be a source for nectar for the bees. The sugar maple, these do have pollen that typically are trees in the early season. They'll have a source of pollen, but there's not typically the reward for that to attract to the female flower. So it's not for pollination, but it does help to feed the bees and other pollinating insects. The Ohio buckeye, these have tubular flowers that are pollinated by the ruby-throated hummingbird, and also the white-tailed deer avoid the fruit because of the poisonous leaves and bark that go with the Ohio buckeye. The river birch, they are native to wetland areas. They are especially important for caterpillars of many moths, and there's other insect feeders that feed on the river birch, such as the morning cloak butterfly. The tulip tree, one of the largest native trees in Illinois, has these distinctive tulip-shaped leaves. Here we see a flower before it is opened on the picture on the right. These also are a food source for the ruby-throated hummingbird. The hickory, here we have shagbark hickory. A large number of insects feed on this, on the wood, on the foliage, plant juices, and other parts. Caterpillars commonly feed, such as the hickory hairstreak and the banded hairstreak, and many other moths. The Kentucky coffee tree. Here we have the Kentucky coffee tree foliage, the compound leaf, and on the lower right hand, the fruit. And so it is a dioecious plant, so you have to have both male and female plants to have the fruit, but you may consider planting male cultivars to avoid that fruit. The American beech, it is to the western range in Illinois for its distribution, but it is the host for many insects, especially moth caterpillars and larvae of wood-boring insects. And so it can grow to 50 to 7 feet tall. The American basswood, it is known for its heart-shaped leaves. It has many longhorn beetles and other native insects that feed on the leaves. A nice one for fall color is the black gum or Nyssa sylvatica. It has excellent fall color. Very few real problems with this particular tree. The hackberry has a lot to offer when it comes to durability in the landscape. It can tolerate drought. These plants have a unique bark, and so you can see that, and you can also see uh, the exoskeleton remains of a common visitor. And so just because we have insects that habitat in our environment, it doesn't mean that they're too detrimental, and so we can just enjoy the insects that are out there. Some small deciduous trees. Here's a serviceberry. This downy serviceberry is often multi-stemmed. It can have quince rust to be a problem on the fruit and leaves, but a nice small tree. Eastern redbud is popular as a small tree, but you also have to caution. I have seen it grown underneath power lines, and it does get to be a little bit tall. It can live approximately for 20 years. You want to protect it from the deer as it's young, but it does offer a host of pollination to bees, honeybees, bumblebees, longhorn bees, cuckoo bees, mason bees, and many others. The bees are attracted both to the nectar and the pollen, and the flowers are quite distinctive, pink. And here we have the red buckeye. The red buckeye has tubular flowers that are attractive for the ruby-throated hummingbirds, and they typically bloom about the time that those hummingbirds are making their way for their spring migration. It can be a deciduous clumping form of shrub or a small tree, usually with a regular rounded crown. The American hornbeam. This particular tree has this distinctive uh, gray-blue bark, and in some cases you can see a mussel-like fluting that gives rise to the other name that it's known by as musselwood. It enjoys full sun, two full shades, so quite adaptable for shady locations, and makes for a good medium-sized understory tree. Here we have the sourwood, has these distinctive blooms and flowers, a native tree to eastern United States, but it also has a beautiful fall color. The American hop hornbeam. This is adaptable to a wide range of light conditions. It's great for an underplanting. It has these hop-like flowers and a good fall color. The dogwood, a nice small tree, Cornice, Florida, being the native. But there are a lot of cultivars that are available for this opposite-leaved small tree. Evergreen trees, just note a few. The white pine, there has been some issues with white pine, but it is a native plant. But probably one that you see in most abundance, eastern red cedar, which is actually a juniper. They have a pretty resilient bark and low on the pest problems, although it can be a host for cedar apple rust. But depending on the type that you have, you may find the bright blue berries. They can be attractive and a food source for birds. Covering some large deciduous shrubs that are over 8 feet. So here we have buttonbush. It's a woody shrub that's adaptable for uh, places that are wet soils. There's 12 native species of bees, flies, and wasps. We also have leaf-feeding insects, about 8 native species. It's highly attractive for pollinators, has this unique flower and seed pod that develops. The gray dogwood is erect and spreading. It can tolerate the sun or shade, and it does have some spread as it can colonize with a reddish purple fall color. The red osier dogwood, known for the beautiful red foliage, it spreads, quite adaptable to different soils, but these red stems are very noteworthy in the winter. Witch hazel, we do have some cultivars or nativars, if you will. Harvest moon, it flowers later than the species around Thanksgiving and the harvest moon. And so that allows for it to be clearly seen, making it a beautiful plant when little else is flowering. Each of the flowers has 4 yellow petals, sepals, and fertile stamens. And it's quite unique that the seed pods explode. And so a slow growing upright plant, but very valued for its flowering and dense foliage. Here's a common elderberry, uh, very popular. It is a plant that can have those native bees to inhabit the stems. There is a few problems, powdery mildew or leaf spots, but a wide variety, over 30 native birds utilize this particular shrub, and over 20 for the native insects that utilize common elderberry. Oak leaf hydrangea, a very upright shrub. The shrub tends to be fast growing. These large flower heads, nice white in color, and you can prune these back in the early spring. Some intermediate sized deciduous shrubs. Here we have possum haw or Ilex decidua. It's commonly called possum haw, and for good reason. It does attract some mammals, including opossums, And you need to make sure that you have at least one male to ensure adequate pollination. The winterberry, another holly, but this particular holly looks distinctive in the winter with these red berries. Again, you're going to need male and female plants to set the fruit. Spice bush, it is relatively a few problems. The red berries in the fall on the female plants, quite moisture tolerant, also tolerant to drought. Woodland birds feed on these berries. There's a difference in the amount of light that for the spread of the shrub. And so we do have these fragrant, showy flowers. Common nine bark. It's quite a popular species, adaptable to pH and tolerant to drought conditions. The birds eat the berries, and it does provide nectar and pollen. American beautyberry, these distinctive berries. This is relatively pest and disease free. The fruit remains attractive for a long time and is not native to Illinois, but is a nice addition to the landscape. The Blackhaw viburnum, it can reach up to 15 feet tall, tolerant of drought and clay soils. 13 native caterpillars utilize the shrub, and the birds feed on the berries. About 21 native species of birds. The inkberry, a nice evergreen foliage, tolerates moist soils, has a good shade tolerance. Oftentimes when I've seen it, it has been utilized in a shady situation. Again, these are dioecious, so you need separate male and female plants, and that should get you those berry-like drupes that you are looking for. And the bees are attracted to the blossoms. Virginia sweetspire, it has distinctive fragrant white flowers. It's a nice small shrub that can do well in both sun and shade, as here in these two photos. It typically is, a small shrub that can need some additional water in dry periods. Sassafras, although it is a shrub of sorts and can spread through suckering, it does have a nice fall color, and if those suckers are removed, it can be developed into a small tree. Now for the low-growing deciduous shrubs under 5 feet, we have a lead plant. It's a typical plant of the prairie. It has this purple color of the flower and can be up to about waist high. New Jersey tea, the white flowers appear on new wood in June. These are tolerant of drought. They do have wildlife value in the nectar and pollen for the bees, wasps, flies, beetles, and butterflies. So quite a adapted shrub for that. The smooth hydrangea, it's blooms on new wood. So these are very fast growing, a broad upright plant. So you want to prune it down so that it maintains its kind of structure as a shrub, but part sun to full part shade to full sun, and has large white flowers. The shrubby St. John's wort has these yellow flowers that develop in June, has a persistent seed capsule, a medium growth rate. You want to look for those blooms from June to August, and the mammals don't feed on the leaves. Fragrant sumac is also quite adaptable. This picture was actually taken from a green roof. These prefer an acidic soil, and again, they're tolerant of a lot of different conditions, and especially salt conditions. So it can have a pungent smell when bruised, and it is a relative of poison ivy, but the poison ivy has more angular leaves and white berries. Coralberry is quite distinctive with these berries that are left to persist in the winter. They're pretty vibrant. They can grow to 5 feet tall, and the clustered fruit does provide a food source for birds, and a pretty interesting characteristic that you can develop it into a shrub border. Here are some resources to find the native plants as far as trees and shrubs in Illinois and their distribution. There's also a native plant finder that if you put in your zip code, you can find the particular flora and fauna that are located in your local locale. And there's also an Illinois native plant guide, and some of these guides can be useful if you're thinking about plant propagation or investigating further into native plants. So I'd be open to questions. And here's my contact information.
Awesome job, Andrew. You had a lot of great information. So we have one question: is one oak tree better for wildlife than others? They're talking in regards to larvae, insects, birds, etc.
From what I could investigate, it seemed to be that a lot of the oaks that are in the core of being in our distribution would probably have a larger majority of insects, and since they're not to the edge of their distribution, but I haven't investigated that fully. But there are just hundreds of insects that are involved with oaks, and that's one of the reasons why they're so important, is the amount of insects that are using oaks for those feeding resources.
That looks like all the questions that we have for now.
I do see another question in the chat. What about wahoo? Is it native? There is a wahoo in the euonymus family that is a native plant.
And then we just had another one. I wondered about scarlet hawthorn, difficult to raise, spreading, so beautiful in color. I need something like thorns for bird protections.
I'm not sure about that particular plant on its adaptability for bird protection.
Can put the evaluation link in the chat box. So if you could fill that out for us, that would be great. We did record the webinar, so we will edit that and get that sent out to you within the week. And then we'll also send out any handouts as well as the slide presentations as well. So there's another question. I have many hawks that dine on my bird feeders. Does anybody have any feedback for Sandy?
Sounds like you're also feeding many different types of birds there.
Yeah, the
You
food chain still exists in the ecology of nature, and so if you have bird feeders, it's just a part of the chain of the food web.
species like Cooper's hawk actually became pretty close to becoming threatened species. And so once many Americans started putting out bird feeders, that interestingly, that species rebounded, but they're known as like bird feeder hawks. They prey on birds at bird feeders. If you do want to discourage that, if it is kind of, you don't like seeing your songbirds getting eaten, really the thing to do is to take your feeder down for 10 days, 2 weeks. The hawk will move on. They will find food elsewhere. And then after a period of time, you can put your feeders back up.
We appreciate you all joining us today for this webinar. I hope you gained some information, and it looks like we have some really nice weather out, so we can go maybe look for some of these plants or put some of this to action this afternoon.
And here again is the evaluation code and link, the QR code if you want to scan that.